The trauma bay went silent the moment she moved. A man's chest had stopped rising. The surgeon standing over him had gone completely still. Scalpel in hand, face drained white, fingers that had performed 300 procedures suddenly refusing to work. Every nurse in the room was watching him, waiting. The monitors screamed. Then the smallest person in the room stepped forward. She was the one they made clean bedpans on double shifts, the one the charge nurse publicly called dead weight during morning briefings, the one the senior surgeon had threatened to fire twice in the past month alone. She grabbed his wrist, moved him aside like furniture. 40 seconds later, the patient's heart restarted. Nobody in that room laughed at her again. But by then, it was already too late for what came next. If this story already has you hooked, follow my channel and stay with me until the very end. Hit like if you want to see justice land exactly where it belongs, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first thing most people noticed about Nora Voss was that she was quiet. Not shy quiet. Not nervous quiet. The kind of quiet that sits in a room and takes up no space at all. The kind that makes people unconsciously assume there is nothing behind it. She moved through the halls of Harlow General Medical Center in Decker's Bluff, Montana, the same way every shift, efficient, unhurried, eyes tracking everything without appearing to track anything. She kept her dark hair pulled back so tight it looked almost military. She wore her scrubs plain, no patches, no pins, no little motivational buttons the way some of the other nurses did. Her ID badge listed her name, her unit, her hire date. Nothing else. She had been working the ER for 11 months. In that time, she had not made a single friend on the floor. That wasn't entirely her fault. Charge nurse Delilah Marsh had made the decision about Nora Voss in her first week, the specific, social kind of decision that charge nurses in busy ERs make all the time, whether they admit it or not. Delilah had 22 years in emergency nursing, a reputation sharp enough to cut glass, and the particular talent of being able to read a new hire's threat level before their orientation paperwork dried. Nora had walked in calm, answered every question with exactly as many words as necessary, and not one more, and had looked at Delilah during the initial floor introduction with an expression that wasn't quite neutral and wasn't quite challenge, but somewhere uncomfortably between the two. Delilah had made a note. By the end of Nora's first month, she was pulling the worst shifts on the board. Double overnights, holiday weekends, the 4-to-4 stretch that broke most nurses inside 6 weeks. Supply requests with Nora's name on them went to the bottom of the pile. If a bathroom break ran 2 minutes long, Delilah was watching the clock. If Nora's patient satisfaction notes came back strong, Delilah found a way to attribute it to the attending physician. It was the kind of harassment that leaves no fingerprints, and Delilah was very good at it. The attending physician was Dr. Roman Holt, and he was a different problem entirely. Roman Holt was 44 years old, double board, certified in emergency and trauma medicine, and he believed, genuinely, without irony, that he was the most important person in any room he entered. He had the jaw for it, and the voice for it, and 20 years of being told he was brilliant had calcified into something that looked like confidence from a distance but was actually something closer to contempt. He spoke to nurses the way some people speak to traffic, as an inconvenience they had to navigate around rather than human beings with independent function. He'd had Nora's incident report thrown back at her twice for formatting errors that weren't errors. He'd countermanded her patient notes in front of the whole floor without reading them first, discovered later he was wrong, and said nothing. He told the residents she was a liability in any critical situation, said it loud enough that she could hear it from the supply room. Nora had heard it, had folded a supply requisition form in half and walked back to her station. Her fellow nurse on the overnight, Marcus Webb, had watched the whole thing from behind a computer screen. "You're not even going to say anything?" Marcus asked her later when they were restocking the crash cart together at 2 a.m. "About what?" "Holt. What he said. The residents heard him." "I know they did." So nothing." She handed him a laryngoscope blade without looking up. "Make sure the 7.5 ETT is sealed. The one in slot 4 has a micro crack in the cuff." Marcus checked. She was right. She was always right about things like that. Small mechanical details that most people walked past without seeing. He'd noticed it early on, the way she noticed things. The way she'd catch a patient's oxygen saturation trending 3 points before the alarm triggered. The way she'd position herself near the door during difficult family conversations. Not obviously, just slightly. The way someone would stand if they were instinctively accounting for every exit. He'd mentioned it to her once, carefully. She'd looked at him for a moment and then handed him a coffee and walked away. Which was, he'd come to understand, her version of changing the subject. Marcus was the only one on the floor who'd tried to actually talk to her. He was 31, former volunteer EMT, still new enough to the ER that the cynicism hadn't fully set in. He'd grown up in a military family, father Army, 2 uncles Marines, and there was something about the way Nora moved, the economy of it, the zero-wasted motion, that reminded him of the men his father had brought home for Sunday dinners. Men who'd seen things. Men who'd learned to take up the exact amount of space a situation required and no more. He'd asked her once, quietly, whether she had military background. She'd said, "I went to nursing school in Tucson," which was not, he noticed, an answer to the question he'd asked. The shift that changed everything started at 6 a.m. on a Thursday in late October. Delilah posted the assignment board at 5:50, and Nora's name was on the trauma bay, paired with a first-year resident named Dr. Chloe Adair, who had been on rotation for 8 days and still looked slightly startled to find herself in an actual hospital. Trauma bay pairing was supposed to go to experienced nurses who could stabilize newer residents. Delilah had pulled Torres, the obvious choice, and put him on observation. It wasn't an accident. "She's going to eat that resident alive," Torres muttered to Marcus as they passed the board. "Nora or Delilah?" Torres shrugged. "Either, but Nora didn't eat the resident alive. She walked into the trauma bay at 6 sharp, checked every piece of equipment herself. Not because she didn't trust the overnight staff, she'd explained to Marcus once, but because in certain situations trusting someone else's prep work without verification was how people died." And then turned to Dr. Adair, who was hovering near the supply cabinet, looking like she might vibrate out of her own skin. "Have you run a trauma response before?" Nora asked. "Simulation? 3 times. "Okay. Different in here. Louder, faster, and people will talk over you. Don't let them. If you give an order, give it once, clearly, and then follow it with your eyes to make sure it happens. If someone doesn't move, say their name and say it again. You clear?" Dr. Adair blinked. "Yeah. Yes, clear." "Good." Nora pulled on her gloves. "Stand over here. Not there. There." The morning was ugly from the start. A pileup on the interstate brought in 3 patients inside 2 hours, and Dr. Holt took the heaviest one, a 50-year-old man with chest trauma and a BP reading that made no physiological sense. Holt moved through the initial assessment with the fluid authority of someone who had done this 1,000 times, calling orders, adjusting, correcting, and then somewhere around the 18-minute mark he hit a wall. The chest x-ray had come back wrong. Not wrong in the way he'd expected wrong. The injury pattern didn't match what his hands were telling him, and for a moment, just a moment, Dr. Roman Holt hesitated. Nora was across the bay with her own patient, a 23-year-old with a fractured pelvis, guiding Dr. Adair through a procedure with the same quiet precision she used for everything. But she'd been watching Holt's patient with the part of her brain that never fully shut off, the part that cataloged ambient data without being directed to, and the hesitation registered. She finished what she was doing, moved across the room. "Tension pneumo," she said, not loudly, just close enough for Holt to hear. "I'm aware of the differential, Voss. Trachea's deviated. You can feel it if you—" "I said I'm aware." His voice had gone sharp and flat, the way it did when he felt crowded. "Step back and manage your own patient." Nora stepped back. She went back to her patient. She did not say another word. Holt proceeded with his own assessment for another 4 minutes. Then he felt the tracheal deviation. He performed the needle decompression. The patient stabilized. Holt straightened up, said nothing to anyone, and walked to the sink to strip his gloves. Across the room, Nora checked the pelvis patient's vitals and wrote the number in the chart. Dr. Adair had watched all of it. "Did you just—" "Chart is yours to complete," Nora said. "Make sure you note the mechanism of injury." By noon, the floor had gone relatively quiet, which in Decker's Bluff in October meant a lull before a weather shift. Marcus found Nora in the break room eating something from a container she'd brought from home. He'd never seen her buy from the cafeteria, reading what looked like a clinical manual with the focus of someone taking an exam. "You okay?" he asked, which was his version of asking whether she'd noticed that Holt had not acknowledged what had happened in the bay. "Fine." Holt caught it eventually. She turned a page. Patient did fine. "Nora." She looked up. "You spotted it 4 minutes before he did. The resident saw it. Torres saw it. You said something and he shut you down and then—" "He caught it," she repeated. "Patient did fine." She closed the manual. "That's what matters." Marcus sat down across from her. He'd been trying to build up to something for about 3 weeks, and he decided today was the day. "I looked up your nursing licensure," he said. She didn't move. "It's current. Everything's clean. But before nursing school, there's nothing. No college transcripts on file. No previous employment records. HR just has this weird gap. 5 years. No history. No addresses. Nothing. I wasn't snooping. I was just... One of the billing staff mentioned it offhand, and I looked it up, and your forearm." Kept his voice low. "The scar that goes from your wrist to your elbow. That's not a surgical scar. I've seen surgical scars. I've seen accident scars. That's..." He stopped. "I was raised around soldiers, Nora. I know what blast trauma looks like when it heals wrong." The break room was quiet. Somewhere in the hall, a cart wheeled past. Nora looked at him for a long moment, not with the blank deflection she usually used. Something different, a kind of measured assessment, like she was calculating the exact weight of the moment and deciding what it could hold. "Finish your coffee," she said finally. "Lowell's not going to last." She stood up, picked up her manual, and walked out. But she hadn't said he was wrong. That was the thing Marcus turned over for the rest of the afternoon. She hadn't corrected him. She hadn't laughed it off. She'd just closed the door quietly, which was more alarming than any denial would have been. The lull broke at 417. A manufacturing plant on the east edge of Decker's Bluff had a structural failure. A loading bay collapse that brought down 2 floors of steel shelving onto a crew of 6 workers. By the time the first ambulance arrived, the ER had already received the mass casualty alert, and Delilah was at the board rewriting assignments with the focused expression of someone who actually enjoyed this part. She did not take Nora off the trauma bay. The first 2 patients came in manageable. Lacerations, fractures, 1 punctured shoulder. The third patient was 38-year-old Miguel Okafor, and he was not manageable. The paramedics gave the rundown fast. Steel shelving unit had come down on him directly, crushing his chest and left side, possible internal bleed, pressure had been dropping in transport. They'd lost the IV line twice, and the second attempt hadn't held. Dr. Holt took one look at the vitals and started calling orders with the authority of someone in full control. He was not in full control. Nora could read it immediately. The slight overspeed in his voice, the way his first order contradicted his second, the fact that he'd called for a type and cross-match, but hadn't ordered the uncrossed O-neg that this patient needed in the next 60 seconds, not 10 minutes from now. She moved to the head of the bed, prepping the airway, saying nothing, doing her job. "Voss, I need access on the left." "Left subclavian's compromised from the crush. I'll go right femoral." "I didn't ask for your assessment. There's no vein to hit on the left," she said flatly. "Right femoral. I'm going." She went. She found the access in one attempt, clean, first stick, and had the line running before Holt had finished recalibrating. She called the blood order over her shoulder without raising her voice. 2 units O-neg, now, confirm. The tech confirmed. Miguel Okafor's BP ticked up 1 point, then 2. Holt was doing a secondary survey, finding what Nora had already identified. Rib fractures on the left, decreased breath sounds that meant either a hemothorax or a pneumo, and the abdomen rigid in the left upper quadrant in a way that said the spleen was probably done. "Chest tube," Holt said. "Agreed," said Nora, and she was already positioned for it. What happened next was the part that Delilah would later describe in her complaint as Nurse Voss performing unauthorized surgical procedures and refusing direct orders to stand down. But what actually happened was that Dr. Holt reached the moment of insertion and his hand stopped. It wasn't a long pause. 2-3 seconds at the outside. But Miguel Okafor's SAT had just dropped to 81%, and in 2 or 3 seconds, a lot of things happen. Nora's hands moved. She completed the insertion. She secured the tube and connected the drainage system, and the chest flooded immediately. Blood, which meant hemothorax, which meant the tube placement was correct. which meant Miguel Okafor got to keep his next heartbeat. The room was briefly, completely silent. Holt stepped back. Nora checked the drainage output, adjusted the line, spoke to the tech about the rate. Her voice was the same as it had always been. Level, specific, no performance in it. What the hell was that? Holt's voice came out low and strange. Chest tube placement. Hemothorax confirmed on output. You performed an invasive procedure on my patient without an order. She looked at him across the gurney. You were going to lose him. That is not... He stopped. Started again. That is not your call to make. He's stable now. Get out of this bay. She didn't move immediately. She finished writing the output measure in the chart, the correct measure in the correct format, and then she stepped back from the gurney. Delilah appeared at the bay entrance as if she'd been waiting. I'll need a full incident report, Delilah said, looking at Nora with an expression that was almost satisfied. And you're off the floor pending review. The patient has a physician, Holt said. Nora looked at Miguel Okafor. His color had come back slightly, the oxygen reading climbing. She looked at the drainage system she'd set up. She looked at Dr. Adair, who was standing at the edge of the room with her clipboard clutched against her chest, looking like she couldn't decide whether to speak or disappear. Nora handed her gloves to the nearest tech. Drainage output every 10 minutes, she said to Dr. Adair. If it changes rate or color, call it immediately. Then she walked out. Delilah's complaint reached hospital administration by 5 o'clock, which was fast even for Delilah. The language in it was specific and chosen carefully. Unauthorized invasive procedure, assault on attending physician, repeated insubordination, clinical liability. And it was supported by Dr. Holt's statement, which he dictated while Miguel Okafor was being prepped for surgical consult. The hospital's legal team reviewed it in under an hour and suspended Nora Voss's floor privileges pending formal investigation. A security officer was tasked with escorting her from the building. Marcus found out from Torres, who'd heard it from one of the OR nurses. He found Nora in the locker room. She was sitting on the bench in her street clothes, already changed, which meant she'd known this was coming, with her hands flat on her knees and her eyes somewhere in the middle distance. They're suspending you, he said. I know. Nora. He sat down across from her. The patient is alive because of what you did. Adair knows it. Torres knows it. The paramedics, everyone who was in that room knows what happened. Knowing and saying are different things, she said quietly. So what are you going to do? She looked at him for a moment. Something moved across her face. Not quite grief, not quite calculation. Something harder than either. There's a phone call I have to make, she said. And then I don't know. What phone call? She stood up, picked up her bag. Nora, thank you, she said. And she said it the way someone says something when they mean it completely and aren't used to saying it. For actually looking, most people don't. She walked to the door, and then Marcus heard the sound. Faint at first, then rapidly louder. Rotors. Multiple rotors, coming from the direction of the highway. He stepped into the hall and looked at the trauma bay window. On the monitor feed from the ER entrance camera, he could see the parking lot filling with flashing lights. Not police lights, not ambulance lights, but something else, something systematic, the kind of organized response that didn't come from local dispatch. His phone buzzed. Mass casualty alert. Interstate bridge collapse on Route 9, 22 miles east. Estimated casualties? Unknown. All available trauma staff. Report immediately. He looked back at the locker room. Nora was already gone. The alert hit every screen in the hospital at once. Marcus stood in the corridor staring at his phone, then at the parking lot feed, then back at his phone. The kind of paralyzed moment where the brain is receiving too much information and processing none of it cleanly. The numbers on the preliminary report kept updating. Estimated vehicles involved, 12 to 17. Bridge deck collapse, partial. Water depth at impact zone, 41 feet. Survivors reported on the bank but not yet triaged. ETA on first units, 11 minutes. 11 minutes. He was already moving toward the trauma bay when Delilah's voice came over the intercom, crisp and authoritative, running through the surge protocol like she'd rehearsed it, which she had. Delilah rehearsed everything. All available trauma personnel to the floor. OR teams on standby. Blood bank to activate massive transfusion protocol. Chaplaincy services notified. Marcus stopped at that last one. Chaplaincy. They only called chaplaincy when they expected a body count. He pulled on his trauma gloves without thinking about it, the way you do after enough years, hands moving independently from the part of his brain still catching up to the situation. Around him, the ER floor had shifted from its mid-evening rhythm into something faster and louder. Nurses pulling supply carts. A resident he didn't recognize jogging toward radiology. The charge desk phones going all at once. He looked at the locker room door. Still closed. He didn't have time to think about Nora Voss. He knew that. He went to his station and started prep. What he didn't know was that Nora hadn't left the building. She'd gotten as far as the ambulance bay doors, the side exit that opened onto the service road, away from the main entrance where the security officer was waiting with the paperwork. And then the mass casualty alert had fired across her phone, and she'd stopped walking. She stood at the door with her bag over one shoulder and her phone in her hand, and she read the alert the way she read everything, completely, parsing the specific language rather than the headline. Bridge collapse. Route 9. That was the old Harmon Creek overpass. She'd driven it twice, knew the structure, 2-lane span, 40-year-old concrete, the kind of bridge that engineers flagged in reports that nobody acted on until the reports became headlines. The water temperature this time of year would be roughly 48 degrees. Hypothermia onset in an unprotected adult, 15 to 25 minutes depending on body composition and physical condition. Crush injuries from vehicle impact with water surface at speed. Pulmonary contusions, traumatic brain injuries from secondary impact. If any vehicles had gone fully submerged, drowning survivorship dropped sharply after the 4-minute mark, and there were no miracles past 8. She was doing the math automatically. She'd been doing this kind of math for a long time. Her suspension paperwork was sitting on Delilah's desk upstairs, unsigned by legal but functionally in effect. Walking back through those doors meant, at minimum, insubordination added to the existing complaint. At maximum, it meant criminal charges for practicing outside her scope, which was already what Holt was pushing for. She looked at her phone, looked at the door. She put the phone in her pocket, pushed the door open, and went back inside. She didn't go to the trauma bay directly. She went to the supply corridor that ran behind it, a long maintenance hallway with a cart bay and a secondary linen storage that most of the nursing staff forgot existed. And she pulled a fresh pair of trauma gloves from the wall dispenser, tied her hair back tighter, and stood still for a moment listening to the shape of what was coming through the walls. The particular pitch of voices in surge. The rhythm of movement that meant the floor was at or past its design capacity. She could read a trauma floor by its sound the way some people read weather by the sky. The first ambulance arrived at 6 minutes past the alert. She gave the team 90 seconds to open the bay doors and receive the patient. Then she moved. The woman in Unit 1 was a 44-year-old secondary school teacher named Sandra Pruitt, who had been driving home from a parent-teacher conference when the bridge gave. She came in semi-conscious, scalp laceration bleeding into her left eye, left arm fractured at a compound angle, and her breathing pattern was wrong. Not the kind of wrong that announced itself with alarms, the quiet kind. The kind that built in the background while everyone focused on the obvious injuries. Rate slightly elevated, depth slightly shallow, the right chest moving fractionally more than the left on each expansion. Nora clocked it from the corridor door. She didn't go in. Holt had that patient, and he was moving with purpose, calling his orders. And the breathing pattern was subtle enough that it might self-correct or it might not. And either way, she wasn't going to get within 20 feet of Roman Holt's patient until she absolutely had to. She moved to Bay 2. Unit 2 was worse. A man in his 60s, no ID recovered yet, GCS of 7 on arrival, both legs crushed from the knees down. Blood pressure 60 over nothing and dropping. The paramedics had the expression of people who had burned through every option they carried and knew it. The ER resident on duty, a second-year named Flores who Nora had seen around but never worked directly with, looked at the incoming vitals and took one breath too long. One breath. The kind of pause that in certain rooms costs a patient everything they have left. She was through the bay door before she consciously decided to go. Nobody saw her come in. The room was too loud, too busy, attention locked on the patient. She moved to the left side of the gurney where the IV line the paramedics had placed was backing up. Access blown, the vein had collapsed in transport, and she replaced it while Flores was still calling for the central line kit, found the antecubital with 2 fingers in the poor light, placed the catheter clean on the first attempt. Peripheral access on the left. Running, she said to the nearest tech, keeping her voice at the same level as everyone else's. The tech looked at the line, confirmed it, didn't ask questions. In Surge, you didn't ask questions when something was working. Pressure's 58, she said to Flores. Get the MTP running. He needs trauma surgery, not a resident workup. Who's your attending on call? Flores blinked at her. Dr. Merritt, but she's in OR 2. Get her on comms right now. She was already checking the abdomen, rigid, left upper quadrant, the kind of rigidity that meant internal bleeding and a clock that had already started. Suspected splenic injury, possible mesenteric tear. Tell Merritt she needs a second OR opened. Flores got on comms. Nobody stopped her. That was the nature of a genuine mass casualty response. The hospital's hierarchy became temporarily permeable in ways that normal operations never permitted. Everyone was moving too fast, the floor was over capacity, and in that environment, a calm person giving correct directions was a functional asset that nobody had bandwidth to challenge. She'd seen it in other settings, different conditions, and the principle held everywhere. In a real emergency, competence creates its own authority. She moved through the floor with that knowledge running underneath everything she did. Bay 3. A construction worker with a chest seal placed backward in the field. She corrected it without commentary, just peeled and replaced, told the tech to maintain pressure. Bay 4. The 17-year-old boy from the bridge, compound collarbone fracture and confusion, pupils unequal. And she spent 4 minutes keeping him still and talking him down from the edge of full panic. Because a panicking patient with a potential spinal injury was a patient who could complete their own damage. What's your name? She asked him. Jamie. His voice came out shredded. Jamie, look at me. She kept both hands light on his shoulders, not restraining, just present. Don't move your head. Eyes on me. What year is it? It's 20. He had to work for it. 24. Good. Who's the president? He told her. She noted the response time, the word retrieval, the way his left eye tracked half a beat behind the right. Your mom's name? She asked. Patricia, was she on the bridge? I don't know if she was. Someone is working on that right now. Right now your job is this. She kept her voice level, not warm, not cold, something steadier than either. Don't move. Keep your eyes on me. If your head starts hurting worse or you feel sick, say so immediately. You understand? Yeah. Say it back. Don't move. Eyes on you. Say something if it gets worse. Good. She flagged Dr. Adair passing in the corridor. Bed 4, unequal pupils, left tracking lag, needs a head CT ordered immediately. And was already moving to the next bay before Adair had finished writing it down. Chad. She worked like that for 29 minutes. She knew the count because she always kept the count. It was a habit from a different life. The kind of habit that got welded into the brainstem rather than the conscious mind. And it ran beneath everything with the reliability of something that had been tested under conditions that made Harlow General's worst nights look manageable by comparison. In 29 minutes, she touched 9 patients, corrected 3 critical errors that nobody else had caught yet, and kept 2 people from deteriorating past the threshold where recovery became a matter of luck rather than medicine. She was replacing the vasopressor line on the unidentified man in Bay 2, now confirmed via wallet ID as Robert Fielding, 61, retired, when Marcus found her. He came around the supply corridor corner and stopped like he'd walked into a wall. She didn't look up. Nora. His voice had the specific quality of someone trying very hard to keep their voice under control. You're still in the building. IV rate on this drip needs checking every 8 minutes until his MAP stabilizes. She finished the adjustment, told the tech, stepped back. Yes, I'm still in the building. They suspended you. Delilah's, if she finds out you're in here right now, it goes from suspension to termination, probable criminal referral, yes. She moved toward the next bed. I know. He followed her. Then why? 9 of the 14 patients through the door tonight had at least one clinical error in their initial workup. She said it simply, without heat. Not negligence. Surge conditions. It happens. But errors in surge conditions are the ones that kill people when they're already at their limit. That is not your job anymore. They took your badge. Marcus. She stopped, turned to look at him fully, and in the overhead lights her face had the quality he'd noticed before. That stripped-down directness, like someone who had spent years in environments where pretense was a liability. How many of those 9 patients were going to make it without the corrections? He didn't answer. Go back to your station, she said. There's a pediatric incoming in the next unit, possible cervical injury. Go be where that patient needs you. He stood there for another 2 seconds, then he went. The pediatric patient arrived 80 seconds later. He was right where she'd sent him. But Delilah found her at the 41-minute mark. It was longer than Nora had expected, but Delilah had been running the surge from the charge desk, adjusting bed assignments, managing incoming reports, coordinating the OR schedule. And it wasn't until one of the floor nurses mentioned casually that she'd seen Nora Voss adjusting the vasopressor rate on Fielding that Delilah had gone completely still. She came to the trauma floor. She moved through the bays with the controlled speed of someone who had been in charge long enough to walk fast without appearing to run. She found Nora in Bay 3, at Sandra Pruitt's bedside, monitoring the breathing pattern she'd flagged an hour ago, which had not corrected itself. Voss. Delilah's voice was quieter than Nora had expected. That was actually worse. Step away. Her right chest. I didn't ask. Her right chest expansion is down 15% from the admission reading. She was treated for hemothorax, but the pattern has shifted. Nora kept her eyes on the monitor. Trachea is drifting. Step away from the patient and step away now. Nora stepped back. Delilah moved closer to the bed, looked at the patient, looked at the monitor, looked at the chest rise. She had 22 years in emergency nursing and she was not a stupid woman, and she could see what she was looking at. She didn't say anything about what she was looking at. You are suspended, she said. You are trespassing. You have touched patients without authorization in a clinical setting while under a formal disciplinary action. Do you understand what that means legally? I understand. Then why are you still standing in my department? Because Sandra Pruitt is going to tension in the next few minutes, and somebody needs to be paying attention to that when it happens. Delilah's jaw tightened. She opened her mouth. The monitor alarmed. Not adrift. A heart alarm. Sat dropping, pressure spiking in a pattern that said the intrathoracic pressure had been building since admission and had just crossed the line. Sandra Pruitt's face went gray in the way faces went gray when the body was running out of compensatory options. Everyone moved. Delilah moved. Nora didn't have to. She was already there. Already had the position. Already had the 14 gauge in her hand. Dr. Holt arrived from the other bay at a run. He saw Nora, saw the needle. His face did something complicated. You are not touching my patient. Tell me your plan, she said. Same as before. Level. Direct. Second intercostal, midclavicular, tell me you've got it, and I'll hand you the needle. He looked at Sandra Pruitt, looked at the SAT reading, 79 and still dropping, looked at the needle. He took the needle. The decompression was immediate. The hiss of air, the SAT climbing, the pressure reading correcting itself like a held breath released. 83, 88, 91, 95. The room ran, the way rooms ran after a close call, fast and relieved, and nobody meeting each other's eyes because that was the kind of moment where looking at someone meant acknowledging how close it had been. Holt stripped his gloves. He walked to the sink. He did not look at Nora. Delilah stood at the bay door with an expression that Nora had never seen on her face before. Not softened, nothing that gentle, but recalculated. The look of someone whose internal model of a situation had been revised against their will by incoming data. I want her out of this building, Holt said to Delilah, not looking at either of them. Whatever it takes. I heard you, Delilah said. That's not... I said I heard you, Roman. The use of his first name landed with enough weight that Holt went quiet. He dried his hands and walked out. Nora wrote in the nursing communication sheet, not the official chart. She wasn't authorized to touch the official chart, but the informal wall pocket form where nurses left notes between entries, the kind that technically didn't exist in the documentation record, but that every experienced floor nurse read as gospel. And she wrote it in the shorthand she'd used all her working life, fast and specific and complete. She was pulling her gloves when the security officer appeared at the bay entrance. He was young, maybe 23, 24, still in the phase of the job where he looked at difficult situations and tried to calculate the path of least resistance before committing to anything. He had his radio in one hand, and his posture had the quality of someone who'd been dispatched to do something and was hoping it would resolve itself without requiring him to do it. Ms. Voss. He cleared his throat. I need to ask you to come with me. The bay went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is happening that people don't want to acknowledge they're watching. Marcus had come to the corridor entrance. Dr. Adair was near the nursing station. Two of the paramedics completing their paperwork had looked up without appearing to. Nora looked at the security officer, at the room, at the patients in the surrounding bays, Robert Fielding holding, the SAT reading on Sandra Pruitt steady at 96, Jamie, the 17-year-old waiting for his CT. She dropped her gloves in the biohazard bin, picked up her bag. Okay, she said. She walked to the door. She didn't look back. Not at Marcus, not at Adair, not at Delilah, who was standing at the charge desk watching her go with that recalculated expression still on her face. She walked through the door and into the main corridor, and the security officer fell into step beside her, not touching her, not quite comfortable enough to try. Up. They walked through radiology, past the elevator bank, past the long window that looked out onto the ambulance bay where a fourth unit was pulling in now, lights running, the bridge collapse still feeding the ER new patients at intervals that hadn't slowed down yet. Nora tracked it peripherally. She didn't stop. The main entrance vestibule was all glass and fluorescent light, and the automated doors opened onto the parking lot and the cold. October in Montana hit her face, and she stopped just past the threshold, not because she needed a moment, but because she was thinking about sequencing. What came first? What came after? The security officer stopped beside her. Ms. Voss, I need you to leave the property. I know. She pulled her phone from her jacket pocket. I've been told to confirm you've left the... I'm not leaving. She said it without hostility, without apology. She found the contact in her phone, listed as R. Hartwell, a name she hadn't dialed in 11 months, and pressed call. It rang twice. Yes. Male voice. No greeting. No preamble. This is Voss. Placement's compromised. Mass casualty in progress. I've been working it without authorization, and the hospital is processing both suspension and criminal referral. She kept her voice flat and factual, the way you spoke to people who needed information, without annotation. Requesting jurisdiction call. 3 seconds of silence, the kind that wasn't hesitation. Location confirmed, the voice said. Stand by. The call ended. She put the phone in her pocket. The security officer was looking at her with the expression of someone who had followed a situation into territory his training hadn't covered. You can go back inside, she told him. I'm supposed to stay until you've left the property. Then stay. She looked at the parking lot. The ambulance bay to her left, lights. The main road to her right, dark. I'm not going anywhere. He radioed it in. Delilah received the notification, read it, set it aside because there were 3 more units en route, and she would deal with Nora Voss when the floor had space to breathe. Marcus received it on the floor text chain. He read it standing at his station and went still for a moment over his patient chart. Then he kept working because that was what the room required. But something had lodged in the back of his mind, and he couldn't shake it, the way she'd said standby to whoever had answered. The 2-second response. The call that lasted 11 seconds total and ended without any of the social friction that normal phone calls carried. He'd grown up with a father who made calls like that. He knew what that kind of call meant. Outside, Nora Voss stood in the parking lot in the cold. The security officer stood a few feet away, not sure what he was doing anymore. Overhead, the parking lot lights buzzed against the dark. In the distance, on the access road, another set of ambulance lights turned the corner. She watched it come. She watched it pull into the bay. She watched the doors open and the paramedics move with the urgency of people who had been moving urgently for the past 90 minutes without a break and were starting to run on the chemical reserves that always ran out eventually. Her hand was on her jacket pocket over the phone. It didn't ring. But she wasn't watching the phone. She was watching the north edge of the parking lot, where the service road met the main drive, where a black SUV had been sitting without its lights on for the last 6 minutes. Dark plates. Engine running. She could see the faint exhaust in the cold air. Nobody had come in or out. It hadn't been there when she'd walked through those doors 11 months ago for the first time, badge in hand, ready to be nobody. It was there now, and it was pointed at the entrance. The security officer hadn't noticed it. He was looking at his phone. Nora looked at the SUV, and the SUV just sat there in the dark. And somewhere above the parking lot, beyond the reach of the lot lights, the cloud cover shifted and a wind came through that smelled like snow and distance, and the particular cold of high elevation in late autumn. She'd stood in colder places than this, waiting for things that were harder than this. She put her hands in her pockets and waited. Inside the hospital, on the trauma floor, Robert Fielding's pressure ticked up another 4 points. Sandra Pruitt sat held steady. Jamie, the 17-year-old, was being wheeled toward CT, his mother having been located, alive, minor injuries, in a different ambulance bay 2 miles away at the urgent care annex, and he was crying in the quiet way people cried when the worst version of a fear turned out to not be true. Nobody out front knew any of that, but Nora had known, before she walked out, that those 3 patients were going to be okay. She'd set it up that way. She'd built the conditions and handed them off and walked away, which was a specific skill, so maybe the hardest one. And she was standing in a cold parking lot with a phone that wasn't ringing yet and a black SUV that was pointing at the door because the other shoe was still in the air. It was going to come down. She just didn't know exactly when. And then the security officer's radio crackled, and dispatch came through, and his face changed in the specific way faces changed when something had been escalated past the level of the person holding the radio. "Ms. Voss," he said. His voice had gone careful. "I've just been told that there's a police unit on the way to formally detain you for the criminal complaint that Dr. Holt filed." She looked at him. "They'll be here in about 4 minutes," he said. "I'm sorry, I'm just telling you what I was told." She nodded once, looked back at the SUV, then at the ambulance bay, then at the road where, 4 minutes from now, a police unit would pull in and everything would either escalate in the direction she'd been preparing for, or it would go the other direction entirely, and there was nothing left to do about it except stand in the cold and let it arrive. "Okay," she said. The SUV didn't move. The wind came through again, colder this time, and at the edge of the dark, past the reach of the lot lights, from a direction that wasn't the access road and wasn't the ambulance bay, came a sound she recognized before her brain had fully cataloged it, low and rhythmic and growing, the unmistakable percussion of rotor blades cutting through cold air at altitude. More than one. Getting louder. The sound hit the parking lot before the lights did. Nora heard it the way she'd heard it in other places. Not with the civilian reaction of looking up and searching the sky, but with the full-body recognition of someone who had spent years calibrating to that specific frequency. Rotors. Multiple aircraft. The pitch said they were coming in fast and low, which meant they weren't searching. They knew exactly where they were going. The security officer looked up. His radio crackled twice and went silent, in the way radios went silent when someone on the other end was deciding what to say. The black SUV's engine cut. 2 doors opened. 2 men got out. Not running, not slow either. The particular measured pace of people trained to move efficiently without broadcasting urgency. Dark civilian clothes, nothing tactical visible. But the way they carried themselves had the same quality Nora's posture had, the same compressed readiness, the same economy. One of them made eye contact with her across the parking lot and gave a single nod. She nodded back. The security officer looked between them. What is... "Go back inside," Nora told him. "Tell your charge desk that incoming federal personnel will be requesting access to the trauma floor in approximately 6 minutes. Federal, go." He went. She could see him through the glass doors, moving fast toward the charge desk, radio already up. The 2 men from the SUV reached her. The taller one, maybe 40, close-cropped hair, the kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and showed it, stopped 2 feet away and said, "Voss." "Reyes," she said, because she recognized him. She hadn't seen him in over a year, but she recognized him. "Commander Hartwell is inbound. 7 minutes." He glanced at the hospital entrance. "How contained is the situation?" "Not very." She said it plainly. "I worked a mass casualty without authorization. The attending has a criminal complaint filed. The hospital's legal team has the suspension processing. Local police have a unit 4 minutes out to formally detain me. Reyes took that in without visible reaction, which she appreciated. And the clinical situation? Stable. I corrected what needed correcting. The floor will hold. Okay. He looked at the second man, a brief exchange that communicated something she didn't have context for. We'll meet the police unit when it arrives. You stay here. I know. He moved toward the entrance. The second man stayed near the SUV. Nora watched the sky to the north where the sound was getting louder, and she stood in the cold with her hands in her pockets and felt for the first time in 11 months the particular relief of not having to pretend anymore. It was smaller than she'd expected, quieter, but it was there. Inside, Delilah heard it first as a change in the security officer's face. He came back through the main doors at something close to a run, which she had never seen him do, and he went straight to the charge desk and said very carefully, "There are federal personnel in the parking lot. Coming inside, I was told to let you know." Delilah looked at him. "Federal?" "Yes, ma'am." "Define federal." "I don't—" "The woman said to tell you federal personnel would be requesting access to the trauma floor." He swallowed. "And there are helicopters." There were, in fact, helicopters. Delilah became aware of the sound as she became aware of it. The way you suddenly noticed a noise that had been building below your conscious threshold, the rotors now loud enough to vibrate slightly in the window glass above the charge desk. She looked at Marcus, who was standing at the medication station and had gone completely still. "Did you know about this?" she asked. "No," he said, which was technically true. He hadn't known. He'd suspected, in the way you suspected things when the evidence was pointing in a direction you hadn't wanted to follow. Delilah picked up the charge phone. She called administration. The administrator on call answered on the second ring, and she gave him a 20-second summary, and the silence on the other end of the line had the quality of someone trying to locate a policy for a situation the policy manual hadn't anticipated. "Hold for now," the administrator said. "Don't let anyone onto the floor without ID. And if the ID is federal?" Another silence. "Get legal on the phone." She was already dialing legal when the helicopters arrived. They didn't land on the roof. Harlow General had a helipad, single aircraft capacity, and they used it for medical transport. What came in now landed in the north section of the parking lot, which was technically not a landing zone and technically not rated for the weight, but the aircraft came down with the precision of crews that had landed in far less forgiving spaces, and the parking lot held and the blades ran down fast. 2 aircraft. Military pattern, civilian paint. The kind of deliberate ambiguity that meant something to people who knew what it meant, and nothing to people who didn't. Dr. Holt heard them from the physician's lounge where he'd gone to document his incident report, which he'd been composing with the careful language of someone building a legal case. He went to the window. He watched the helicopters come down. He watched the people get out. There were 6 of them from the 2 aircraft, plus what looked like a 7th figure, taller, moving with authority, heading directly for the main entrance, rather than spreading out the way the others were spreading out. Holt watched this figure, and something in his chest contracted in a way he didn't have an immediate explanation for. He saved his incident report. He closed his laptop. He went back to the floor. The police unit arrived at the same time the helicopters were still spinning down, which was timing that nobody had planned, but that turned out to matter. A patrol car pulled into the ambulance bay. 2 officers, standard response to a criminal complaint, nothing complicated from their perspective, just a detainment order with a name and a location attached. One of them had the paperwork on his phone. They were both younger than 30, and neither of them had ever been on a call that intersected with whatever this was. Reyes met them at the bay entrance. He had his credentials out before they could speak. Not a badge, not a standard federal ID, something else. A laminated card with the kind of classification markings that made both officers go quiet and look at each other. "The individual named in your detainment order is currently cooperating with a federal operational review," Reyes said. He said it without inflection, like he was reading a weather report. "We're requesting a hold on the local action pending coordination with your department's federal liaison." The older of the 2 officers looked at the credentials, looked at the helicopters, looked back at the credentials. I'd need to call this in." "I'd expect you to." Reyes handed him a card. "That number goes to the coordination desk. They'll confirm." The officer stepped away to make the call. Nora, watching from 20 feet away, allowed herself to look at this and feel nothing in particular about it, which was the only functional approach. The machinery was engaging the way it engaged. She'd seen it from the other side, the moment when a situation changed jurisdictions and the people on the ground had to decide whether to push back or step aside. And it was always the same: a brief turbulence, then a realignment, then everyone finding the new structure and settling into it, because the alternative was chaos, and nobody in a uniform wanted chaos. The officer came back. He looked at Reyes, he looked at Nora. "We'll hold pending confirmation from the liaison," he said, "but the complaint is still filed." "Understood," Reyes said. "We appreciate the cooperation." The officer didn't look like he felt cooperated with. He looked like a man who had driven out on a routine detainment and arrived in a situation with layers he couldn't count. He went back to his vehicle. He stayed. And then the figure from the first helicopter reached the main entrance, and Nora finally got a clear look. Commander Dale Hartwell was 52 years old, built like someone who had been athletic once and had compressed rather than softened with age, and he walked with the slight forward lean of a man perpetually moving toward the next thing that needed his attention. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, plain shirt, but the way he wore them had the quality of a uniform regardless. He saw Nora, and he changed direction slightly without breaking stride. "Voss, Commander?" He stopped in front of her and looked at her the way someone looked at something they'd been tracking from a distance for a long time and had finally reached. Not warm, not cold, assessing. "You made the call yourself," he said. "Placement was already blown before I called. I worked the mass casualty. I'd make the same decision again." Something moved in his face. Not disapproval. Something closer to the resignation of a man who had expected this answer. The situation inside. Criminal complaint filed by the attending, Dr. Roman Holt. Charge nurse Delilah Marsh supporting. Hospital administration has legal involved. The complaint is for unauthorized invasive procedures. I performed a chest tube insertion on a trauma patient who was going to die without it. She said it factually. The patient is alive. And before that, 11 months of documented harassment, assignment manipulation, and systematic marginalization. I didn't report it. It wasn't operationally relevant until tonight. Hartwell looked at the hospital. "It's relevant now." "Yes, sir." He turned to Reyes, and the exchange between them was brief. 4 sentences, 2 responses. And then Hartwell was moving toward the main entrance, and the team was falling in around him, and Nora followed, which was the first time in 11 months she'd walked into Harlow General Medical Center without having to be something she wasn't. The trauma floor had the charged atmosphere of a room that knew something was coming and didn't know what shape it would take. Delilah was at the charge desk when they came through the main corridor. Hartwell in front, Reyes flanking, 4 others in a loose formation, and Nora at the back. Delilah had seen a lot of things in 22 years of emergency nursing. She had never seen this. The administrative on-call had arrived in the past 10 minutes and was standing near the nursing station with his phone in his hand. And he looked at the approaching group and looked at his phone as if checking whether a call he was expecting had come in yet. It hadn't. This was moving faster than administrative processes moved. Hartwell stopped at the charge desk. "I need the floor administrator and your chief medical officer," he said to Delilah. Not impolitely, just directly, the way someone spoke when they were past the part of the conversation that required social framing. Delilah looked at him, looked at the credentials he placed on the desk. She read them with the focused attention she brought to everything, and her face did something small and controlled. "CMO is off-site tonight. I can reach him by phone. Administrator on call is—" "I'm here," the administrator said from the side. Hartwell turned to him. They spoke for a minute and a half, low enough that the words didn't carry, but the shape of the conversation was clear. The administrator's expression progressing from controlled professional concern through something approaching alarm to a final settled blankness that meant he had received information and was now processing what it meant for every decision he'd made in the last 6 hours. Marcus watched from the medication station. He had stopped pretending to work. He was watching Nora, who had positioned herself near the entrance to the trauma bays and was watching the floor. Not Hartwell, not Delilah, not the administrator, but the patients, the monitors, the staff moving between beds. She had the same quality she'd had all night, that stripped-down attentiveness. but without the weight she'd been carrying. Something had shifted. Dr. Holt appeared from the physician's corridor. He stopped when he saw the group at the charge desk. His gaze went to Hartwell, then to the other personnel, then to Nora, and his face went through several things in quick succession before settling on the expression he used when he was about to take control of a situation. He walked toward them. "I don't know who you people are, but this is a working trauma floor in the middle of a mass casualty response, and I'm going to need Dr. Roman Holt." Hartwell said it like a fact, not a greeting. Holt stopped. "Yes. I'm Commander Dale Hartwell. We'll need to speak privately in approximately 20 minutes. Right now, I need to assess the clinical situation on this floor." He looked at Holt with the detached clarity of someone who had already read a file. "That assessment will include the events of this evening. The events of this evening include a suspended staff member performing unauthorized. I'm aware of the complaint." Hartwell's voice didn't change pitch or volume. "We'll address it." "You'll address it." Holt said it with the reflexive incredulity of a man who is used to being the one who addressed things. "Who exactly are you people? What agency? What—" "Dr. Holt." This time it was Nora from near the trauma bay entrance. Her voice was quiet, the same tone she'd used all night, the tone that didn't perform authority but didn't leave room to question it either. "Your patient in Bay 2 has had a pressure trend. I'd want someone checking right now." Everyone looked at her. She wasn't looking at anyone. She was looking at the monitor feed on the wall display near the bay entrance, the one that showed real-time vitals for all active trauma bays. Robert Fielding. Bay 2. His pressure had dropped 4 points in the last 8 minutes. Holt looked at the display, looked at Nora. Something crossed his face. Not gratitude, not anything close to gratitude, but the involuntary recalibration of a physician who had just been outmaneuvered by his own instincts. He turned and went to Bay 2. Nora watched him go. Hartwell watched Nora. The formal administrative meeting happened in the conference room adjacent to the CMO's office. The administrator, the on-call legal counsel who'd arrived in the past 20 minutes, looking like she'd dressed in the dark, Hartwell and Reyes. The other 4 personnel were distributed across the floor in positions that weren't quite observable posts, but weren't casual either. Nora was not in the meeting. She was in the corridor outside the trauma bays, standing where she could see the monitor display, because the floor was still running a mass casualty response, and it didn't stop running because the administrative situation had changed. That was the thing about medical emergencies. They had no interest in institutional drama. The patients kept trending. The timers kept running. Marcus came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. She didn't either. They stood watching the monitor display together the way they'd stood at the crash cart at 2 a.m, the comfortable silence of people who had spent enough hours in proximity to not need to fill the space. "How long have you known this was coming?" he asked finally. "I knew it was a possibility when I called." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "When I came back through the side door tonight, after the alert. So you chose to work the mass casualty knowing this would happen?" "I chose to work the mass casualty," she said. "The rest was consequence." He processed that. "The people in the black SUV, were they watching the hospital before tonight, before you made the call?" She looked at the monitors. "That's not something I can answer." "Nora, Marcus." She turned to face him fully. "There are parts of this I'm not going to be able to give you, not because I don't trust you, because they're not mine to give." He accepted that with the quiet of someone who'd grown up understanding that some information had a shape that couldn't be shared. His father had kept things the same way. Not secrets exactly, more like weight that was distributed in a particular way and couldn't be redistributed without structural consequence. "The scar on your arm," he said, "that wasn't from Tucson." "No." "The redacted employment history?" "No." "The way you work." He looked at the trauma bays. "The way you've always worked, the way you moved in that room tonight, the way you knew where everything was going before it got there." He paused. "That's not nursing school." "No," she said again, quietly. He didn't push for more. She was grateful for that. From inside conference room, they could hear, not words, just the architecture of a difficult conversation. The particular rhythm of institutional certainty encountering facts that didn't fit it. Legal counsel asking questions, Hartwell answering with the particular controlled completeness of someone releasing information in specific measured amounts. Then Holt's voice from Bay 2, calling for a new lab draw, and Nora's attention snapped back to the monitor without effort, the same way it had snapped back to every clinical detail all night, and she watched the Bay 2 display and waited. Dr. Adair found her 15 minutes later. The resident had the look of someone who had been awake too long and was running on the adrenaline of a shift that had become something else entirely, and she stopped in front of Nora with the directness of someone who had decided to say a thing and was going to say it before she thought better of it. "I want you to know that I'm going to tell them what I saw," Adair said, "in Bay 3, with Sandra Pruitt, and with the patient from the industrial accident, Miguel Okafor." She had her chart under one arm, and her jaw was set with the particular firmness of someone not entirely confident in their courage but committed to it anyway. "I'm going to tell them exactly what happened and exactly what you did." Nora looked at her. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." "It could complicate things for you. Holt's complaint is on record." "I'm a first-year resident," Adair said. "I don't have any political capital to protect, but I have eyes, and I have a memory. And I'm not going to stand in a room and say nothing when someone asks me what happened tonight." She paused. "You told me to say the facts and say them clearly. That's what I'm going to do." Nora held her gaze for a moment. There was something in the resident's face, not heroism, nothing that dramatic, just the specific determination of a young physician deciding what kind of doctor she was going to be at the first real crossroads. It was a decision that happened once, usually early, and the version you chose in that moment tended to hold. "Thank you," Nora said. Adair nodded, went back to her patients. Marcus had watched the exchange. "She's going to be good," he said. "Yes," Nora agreed. "She is." The conference room door opened. Hartwell came out first. Behind him, the legal counsel had the expression of someone who had just been informed that the ground under a structure they were responsible for was less stable than the original survey suggested. The administrator looked like he hadn't blinked in 10 minutes. Holt was in the corridor. He'd come back from Bay 2 at some point, the pressure trending stable, the lab draw ordered, and he was standing near the nursing station with his arms crossed and the expression of a man waiting to be addressed, which was how Holt typically stood when he believed a situation owed him something. Hartwell walked to him directly. "Dr. Holt, I need 5 minutes." Holt uncrossed his arms. "I've been waiting." "I know, 5 minutes." He gestured toward the physician's consultation room, which was small and had a door that closed. "Please." Holt went. Hartwell followed. The door closed. The corridor was briefly quiet, the floor noise continuing, monitors and movement, and the ambient sound of a hospital that hadn't stopped working. But in the social space around the charge desk, quiet. Delilah was still at her station. She had been managing the floor with the same uninterrupted competence she'd brought to every surge she'd ever run. Because the patients didn't care about the rest of it, and Delilah cared about the patients in the particular way of someone who had organized her entire professional identity around the function of emergency nursing, whatever else she'd attached to that identity along the way. She looked at Nora. Nora looked back. "Fielding's pressure is holding," Nora said. Delilah's expression moved through something she didn't let finish. "I know." The nursing notes in the wall pocket for Bays 3, 4, and 6, the informal ones, they have the full clinical picture for all 3 patients. Whoever takes over the coverage should read them. "I'll make sure they do," Delilah said it flatly. Not warm, but she said it. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement that had passed between them in 11 months, and they both understood what it was and what it wasn't, and neither of them felt the need to make it larger than it was. The consultation room door opened. Holt came out first. His face had changed. Not broken. Roman Holt was not a man whose face broke easily, but reconfigured, the way a room looked when furniture had been moved while you were out of it. Something that had been in the center was no longer in the center. He walked toward the nursing station, stopped when he was close enough to Nora that the conversation would be audible to Marcus and Delilah and nobody else, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been shown a room he hadn't known existed in a building he thought he knew completely. He didn't say anything immediately. She waited. "The patient this afternoon," he said finally. "Okafor." He said the name like he was using it to anchor himself. "He's in the ICU. Spleen's out, but he's stable, Nora said. I know. Holt looked at her. At the scar on her forearm where her sleeve had pushed up during the evening's work. At her hands, which were resting at her sides without tension. He looked at all of this with the expression of someone trying to reconcile a complete picture from parts that had previously made a different picture. Who are you? He said. It came out less like a question and more like a sentence that hadn't finished deciding what kind of sentence it was. Nora didn't answer. Hartwell had come up beside her. That's actually what we're here to discuss, he said, and he said it to Holt, but he was looking at the room, at Marcus, at Delilah, at the floor. And his voice carried just enough that it reached the people within it needed to reach. I'd like to do that in a setting where the relevant parties are present. Relevant parties, Holt repeated. Holt. There are some things about Nurse Voss that affect the context of everything that's happened tonight. Hartwell's voice was even, unhurried. Things that will make certain events clearer. He looked at Nora. She looked at the floor, at the monitor display, at Robert Fielding's vitals ticking along on the screen, steady, holding, the small green numbers that meant a 61-year-old retired railroad worker was going to go home eventually to whatever home he had. She had not done it alone. She had never done anything entirely alone. But she had done what she came in here to do, and the accounting of it was still in progress. When? She asked Hartwell. Now, he said. Conference room. All relevant staff. Marcus pushed off from the wall. Adair appeared from Bay 4. The administrator, looking like he'd aged 2 years and 40 minutes, was already moving toward the conference room. Legal counsel was on her phone, one hand pressed to her other ear, walking fast in the opposite direction before reversing and following. Holt stood in the corridor and didn't move. He had the look of a man who had filed a criminal complaint 3 hours ago and was only now beginning to understand what he had filed it against. Delilah came around from the charge desk. She pulled a nurse from the second shift to cover the station. 4 words, efficient, done. And then she walked toward the conference room with the deliberate stride of someone who had spent 22 years never walking away from a thing she needed to see through to the end. Nora was the last to move. She looked at the monitor display one more time, all stable. The mass casualty was moving into recovery rhythm. The acute phase done, the sustained care phase beginning, the floor settling into the long work of keeping alive the people who had made it through the first hours. She turned toward the conference room, and then her phone buzzed. She stopped, pulled it out. The number on the screen was not Hartwell's and was not Reyes's. It was a number she'd seen exactly once before, 18 months ago, at a briefing she wasn't supposed to have attended, in a room that officially didn't exist. She looked at it. She answered. Voss? Said the voice on the other end, and it was not a voice she recognized, which meant this was not a call from her chain of command. This is OIG, Office of the Inspector General. We've been monitoring the situation at Harlow General for approximately 4 hours. A pause, the deliberate kind. We've also been monitoring something else for considerably longer. There's a reason Commander Hartwell's team arrived as quickly as they did, and it isn't entirely about your placement. She kept her face neutral. In the conference room, through the glass, she could see Hartwell getting ready to begin. What is it about? She said. The charge nurse at your facility, Marsh Delilah. We've had an open inquiry into patient records manipulation and procurement fraud at Harlow General for 7 months. Another pause. And your attending physician, Holt. The incident report he filed tonight is the 3rd time in 14 months he's attempted to use the administrative process to suppress a staff member who challenged his clinical decisions. The previous 2 staff members both resigned before the investigations could be completed. Nora looked through the glass at Delilah, who was taking a seat at the far side of the conference table. At Holt, who had finally followed the group in and was standing against the wall with his arms crossed. You're telling me this now, she said. Why? Because in about 4 minutes, Commander Hartwell is going to explain who you are to the people in that room. And when he does, both Marsh and Holt are going to understand that their positions are significantly more compromised than they currently believe. The voice on the other end was precise and unhurried. We want you to know, before you walk into that room, that we are already there. We have been there. And what happens in the next hour will not be the end of the accounting. It will be the beginning. The call ended. Nora stood in the corridor for 3 seconds. Then she put her phone in her pocket and walked into the conference room and closed the door behind her. Hartwell looked at her from the head of the table. He hadn't started yet. He was waiting, she understood now, for her specifically, which meant some version of this conversation had been planned, even if the timeline had been accelerated by the events of the night. He looked at the room, at the administrator, at legal counsel, at Holt against the wall, at Delilah with her hands flat on the table, at Marcus and Adair sitting close together with the particular posture of people who were witnesses and knew it. "What I'm about to tell you," Hartwell said, "is going to change how you understand everything that happened here tonight." He placed a single file folder on the table. He opened it, and Delilah Marsh, who had built 11 months of institutional certainty on the assumption that Nora Voss was nobody, looked at the first page and went absolutely still. The first page of the file was a photograph, not a personnel photo, not the kind of staged headshot that lived in HR folders. It was a field photograph, the kind taken in conditions where nobody was thinking about framing or light, where the camera existed only to document. It showed a woman in tactical gear crouched over a patient in what was clearly an active situation environment. Dust, low visibility, the kind of structural chaos in the background that meant the building behind her had recently been something else. The woman's face was turned partially away from the camera, but her hands were visible, both of them, working with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this specific thing many times before. Delilah looked at this photograph for 4 seconds. Then she looked at Nora. Nora was sitting at the side of the table, not the head, not the far end, the middle, which put her equidistant from everyone in the room, which Hartwell suspected was not accidental. She was looking at the table surface, not at Delilah, not at the photograph, waiting. Hartwell gave the room another moment. Then he spoke. "Chief Petty Officer Nora Voss," he said, and the title landed in the conference room the way a stone landed in still water. The initial impact, then the rings moving outward. Special Operations Combat Medic, Naval Special Warfare Command. 4 deployments, 3 theaters. 17 confirmed field surgical interventions under active threat conditions. The last deployment ended 14 months ago following a critical incident that resulted in significant casualties within her unit. He said it without theater. That was the thing about Hartwell. He had the kind of voice that treated facts as sufficient, that didn't believe information needed dressing to be effective. And it was effective. The room was the quietest it had been all evening. She was placed at Harlow General Medical Center as part of a classified recovery and reintegration program for special operations personnel transitioning back to civilian function following combat trauma. He closed the file folder. He didn't need it anymore. The placement was designed to provide structured civilian clinical environment with controlled stakes while allowing physical and operational recovery. It was not, under any circumstances, designed to be a disciplinary assignment or a performance evaluation. She was here because she needed to be somewhere, and this was where the program placed her. Legal counsel had her pen against her notepad and had not written anything. The administrator was looking at the table. Dr. Adair, beside Marcus, had her hands folded in her lap, and her face was doing the thing young physicians' faces did when they were rapidly reconstructing an understanding of events they thought they'd already understood. Holt was against the wall. His arms were no longer crossed. They were at his sides, which for Holt was a posture Nora had never seen. It made him look slightly unmoored, like the structure he usually held himself in had been adjusted without his consent. Delilah had not moved since the photograph. The incident report filed by Dr. Holt tonight, Hartwell continued, alleges unauthorized invasive procedures and assault. What the report does not address, because Dr. Holt was not in possession of the relevant information, is that Chief Petty Officer Voss has performed more field surgical procedures under more demanding conditions than the majority of attending trauma surgeons in civilian practice. He looked at Holt, not with hostility, with precision. The chest tube she placed tonight was her 43rd documented field procedure of that type. The first was performed under direct enemy fire in conditions where the alternative was watching a fellow operator die in the dirt. The room was completely still. "The patient, Miguel Okafor, is alive," Hartwell said. "The patient, Sandra Pruitt, is alive. The multiple patients Chief Petty Officer Voss intervened with during the mass casualty response are alive or in stable condition. That is the clinical record of this evening." He paused. The question of whether the administrative record reflects that accurately is what we are here to discuss. Holt was the first one to speak, because Holt was always the first one to speak. It was reflexive, the occupational conditioning of a man who had spent 2 decades in rooms where being the first to speak was how you established the terms. She still violated protocol, he said. Regardless of her background, she was suspended. Dr. Holt! Hartwell's voice was even. The suspension was generated by a complaint you filed 40 minutes after Chief Petty Officer Voss corrected an error in your clinical assessment of a critically injured patient. He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. I want to be careful here, because I'm not in the business of second-guessing clinical decisions made in real time under pressure. But the complaint that followed that correction, the speed of it, the language of it, is something we are going to look at carefully. Holt's jaw tightened. That's an accusation. It's a statement of process. Hartwell looked at him. You filed a complaint within 40 minutes of a clinical challenge that turned out to be correct. This is the 3rd time in 14 months you've initiated administrative action against a staff member who contradicted a decision of yours that was later found to be incorrect or suboptimal. He opened a second folder, thinner, a different color, and slid it 4 inches across the table, not to Holt, just into the general space. I don't think you planned it as a pattern. I think it developed. But it developed, and 3 people's careers were affected by it. And one of those people is sitting at this table. Holt looked at the folder. He didn't pick it up. I want legal present for any further discussion, he said. His voice had gone tight. That's your right, Hartwell said, and we'll accommodate it, but I want you to understand something clearly before this meeting concludes. He looked at Holt directly, and there was nothing personal in it, nothing punitive, just the flat clarity of someone whose job was to be clear. The criminal complaint you filed will not proceed. Federal jurisdiction supersedes the local complaint. Any further action against Chief Petty Officer Voss through the hospital's administrative process will be reviewed by my office and by the OIG, which has an open inquiry at this facility that predates tonight by 7 months. Holt's face changed. The OIG. Yes. What is the inquiry? That's a separate matter, Hartwell said. But it's relevant context. The room shifted. Nora could feel it. The weight redistribution that happened when the people who had held the institutional leverage became aware that the leverage had changed hands. It wasn't a dramatic shift. It was the specific, quiet shift of a foundation moving, and the building above it hadn't caught up yet. She looked at Delilah. Delilah was looking at the second folder. The OIG component came from Reyes, who had entered the conference room quietly during Hartwell's presentation and now stood near the door with a tablet in his hand and the expression of someone who had spent the last 4 hours preparing documentation that he was now ready to deploy. He addressed the administrator directly, because the administrator was the institutional authority in the room, and Reyes was precise about chains of command even when he was in the process of disrupting them. The open OIG inquiry involves 2 primary areas, he said. Patient record alterations in the ER department, specifically documentation changes made after the fact to shift accountability for adverse events, and procurement irregularities in medical supply ordering going back approximately 22 months. He looked at his tablet. The documentation review identified a pattern of record alterations concentrated in the charge nursing function, specifically alterations to nursing notes, incident reports, and patient assessment records that affected how clinical errors were attributed. The administrator said, "Who?" and then stopped himself, because he already knew, and saying it as a question was the kind of thing you did when you needed a moment. Delilah said, "I want a lawyer." The room went quieter than it had been before. Reyes nodded. "That's your right, and we'll pause the relevant portion of this meeting until you have representation present." He looked at her with the same detached precision Hartwell used. "But the documentation itself isn't going to change while you're waiting. The alterations are time-stamped in the system metadata. Digital records of that type are thorough." Delilah's face had gone through several things in rapid sequence and had landed on something that was not quite defiance and not quite collapse, but somewhere in the exhausted space between them. She was a woman who had built her professional identity on being the person who knew everything that happened in her department, who controlled the information environment of the floor, who decided what was seen and what was managed and what was buried. She had been very good at it for a very long time. She had not anticipated that the quiet nurse she'd spent 11 months dismissing was in a room with people who had been watching for 7. "I need to call someone," she said. "Of course," Reyes said. He stepped back from the door. Delilah stood. She picked up her phone from the table and she walked out of the conference room and into the corridor, and through the glass wall Nora watched her go. The straight back, the controlled walk, the 22 years of authority in every step. Still there, technically, still present in the posture, but something beneath it had gone out. Marcus watched too. He looked at Nora. "Did you know?" he asked quietly. "About Delilah, the OIG thing. I was told 4 minutes before I walked in here. You didn't look surprised." "I wasn't entirely," she said it carefully. "Some of what she did, the record adjustments, I saw the results of it. I just didn't have proof of the source. I assumed it was case management. I was wrong about where it was coming from, not about what it was." He thought about that. 11 months, he said. "You saw it for 11 months. I saw the effects. It's different." "Did you report it?" She looked at him. "To who?" "She was the charge nurse. The administrative structure ran through her. If I'd filed a complaint, it would have landed on her desk." He didn't have an answer for that because it was true, and it was also the specific structural trap that harassment in institutional settings always created. The person with the power to suppress was also the person you were supposed to report to, and the people above them had no reason to look unless someone made them look. Someone had made them look. Eventually. It just hadn't been Nora. She wondered briefly who it had been. She didn't ask. Holt left the conference room at Hartwell's suggestion, not a forced exit, a tactical one, the kind of quiet direction that made itself easy to follow. He was told someone from the OIG team would be in touch within the next 48 hours to discuss the previous complaint filings. And he had responded to this information by putting on the expression of a man who was beginning to understand that the incident report he'd filed at 5 o'clock this evening was going to be the least of what he had to explain. He walked to the physician's lounge. He closed the door. Through the lounge window, visible from the corridor, Marcus saw him sit down at the table and put both hands flat on the surface and look at them. Just look at them, motionless, the way someone looked at their hands when they were trying to understand how they had arrived at a particular place. Marcus had never felt sorry for Roman Holt before tonight. He found to his own surprise that he didn't feel sorry for him now either. But there was something in the image, the hands flat, the stillness, that registered as human in a way that Holt had rarely registered as human during the past year. It didn't change what he'd done. It just made the shape of it more complete. In the conference room, Hartwell was speaking with the administrator and legal counsel about the specific steps that would follow: the formal withdrawal of the criminal complaint, the federal jurisdiction filing, the process for the OIG inquiry to run parallel to the hospital's own internal review. It was the procedural aftermath of a crisis, the long work of translating events into institutional language that systems could process, and it was necessary, and it was also, like all such work, somewhat removed from the actual human texture of what had happened. Nora was no longer in the conference room. She had slipped out during the procedural discussion, not dramatically, just the way she moved through spaces generally, taking up exactly the room the moment required and no more. And she was in the corridor near the trauma bay entrance, at the monitor display watching the numbers. Robert Fielding. Pressure stable, trending upward now. He would almost certainly make it. Sandra Pruitt. Sat 97, breathing pattern normal, the tension pneumo-resolved and not rebuilding. She would make it. Jamie, the 17-year-old, CT had come back, subdural bleed, small, being managed conservatively, the unequal pupils correcting. He would make it. The mass casualty from the bridge collapse had processed through with a final count of 16 patients. 3 had been critical on arrival. All 3 were alive. She stood at the monitor display and looked at these numbers and felt what she felt about them, which was not triumph and was not relief exactly. It was the particular sober satisfaction of someone who had done the thing the situation required and had not made errors that couldn't be corrected. It was a smaller, quieter feeling than the outside of it looked. It always had been. Dr. Adair appeared beside her. The resident had her white coat slightly crooked, hair escaping from its tie, the general dishevelment of a physician who had been moving continuously for 8 hours. "How are you doing?" Adair asked. Nora considered the question. "Tired." "Yeah." Adair looked at the monitors. "Me too." A pause. "I told Hartwell's team what I saw tonight. All of it. The chest tube, the tension pneumo, the interventions during the surge. I gave them the timeline." She looked sideways at Nora. "I also told them about the industrial accident this afternoon. Miguel Okafor. What I saw Dr. Holt do, and not do, and what you did." "I know. Thank you." "Don't thank me. I just told them what happened." Adair shifted her chart. "But they listened. They took notes on everything." Nora nodded. "That was the thing about OIG investigators. They listened to everyone who had been in the room, which was why institutional suppressors worked so hard to make sure the rooms were empty of witnesses when the important things happened. Tonight's room had not been empty. Tonight had been, among other things, a room full of witnesses who had all seen the same thing from slightly different angles, and the composite picture they produced was not ambiguous. She looked at the monitor display one more time. Then she turned away from it, because the acute phase was done, and the patients were covered, and standing at the display was no longer her function. The administrator found her 20 minutes later in the break room. She was sitting where she'd sat when Marcus asked her about her past. Same chair, same table, same fluorescent light that buzzed slightly on cold evenings. She had a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. The administrator stood in the doorway for a moment, a man of 50-something in a good suit that had acquired the rumpled quality of a long and difficult evening, and he looked at her with the expression of someone who had several things he needed to say and was trying to identify which one went first. He came in, sat down across from her. He didn't have the authority posture he'd come in with earlier. It had left him sometime during the conference room meeting and hadn't come back. "I want to start by saying that I was not aware of the OIG inquiry," he said. "I want that on record." "Okay. I also was not aware of your background, your actual background." He looked at his hands. "When the suspension was processed this evening, I reviewed Marcia's complaint and Holt's statement, and I approved the action based on what I was presented with. I didn't look further." "You acted on the information you had," Nora said. "I acted on incomplete information that I should have questioned." He said it flatly, without the softening that administrators usually applied to their own missteps. It was a small thing, the absence of that softening. It was also, she thought, the most honest thing he'd said since she'd met him. "The hospital will be formally withdrawing the suspension and all associated documentation. Legal is processing it tonight. You'll receive written confirmation before morning." "All right. There will also be—" He stopped. "There should be an apology. On behalf of the institution. I recognize that's insufficient." "It's a start," she said. He nodded. He started to stand, then stopped. "Can I ask you something?" She waited. "The patients tonight, the ones you intervened with during the surge." He said it carefully, not accusatorially, with the genuine uncertainty of someone trying to understand a thing. "You knew you were risking criminal charges. You knew it was going to accelerate everything, and you still went back in." She looked at her coffee. "The math wasn't complicated. It was to everyone else. It's about what you practice," she said. "Not in the clinical sense, in the daily sense. If you practice calculating the personal cost of a decision before you calculate the patient's need, eventually the personal cost wins. I've been in situations where that habit gets people killed." She paused. "I didn't develop the other habit by choice exactly. It was trained into me, but it holds." He was quiet for a moment. "Where were you?" he asked. "Before this." She looked at him. "That's not something I'm able to answer." He accepted that. He stood. He left. She sat with her coffee for another minute. Then she poured it out and washed the cup, which was what she did at the end of every shift, the small domestic ritual of a person maintaining the structure of ordinary life in whatever space they occupied. She dried the cup and set it on the rack. Marcus was in the corridor when she came out. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his eyes closed in the posture of someone who had been awake for a very long time and was taking whatever vertical rest was available. He heard her and opened his eyes. "Fielding's wife is here," he said. "They found her. She's been in the waiting room since midnight." "Is someone with her?" "Adair went out. She's with her now." He paused. She asked about the nurse who helped him, in the bay. The attending in the OR told her there had been some intervention before surgery that made the difference. She wanted to know who. Nora said nothing. "I told her a nurse named Voss was on the floor tonight," Marcus said. "I didn't say anything else." He looked at her. "That was the right call." "Yes?" She said it quietly. "That was the right call." He nodded. They stood in the corridor together, and the floor moved around them. The night shift doing its work, monitors beeping in their various registers, the ambient sound of a hospital that had come through a difficult evening and was settling into the long, quiet work of keeping its patients alive through the rest of the night. "What happens to you now?" Marcus asked. She thought about it. Not the institutional part. That was procedurally defined, and she could see the shape of it clearly enough. The complaint withdrawn, the suspension reversed, the OIG proceeding on its own track. Those were processes. They would run. She was thinking about the other thing, the part that wasn't procedural. "I don't know yet," she said, and she said it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to say things that she didn't know the answer to. "Are you going back?" he asked. "To the other thing, the work before this?" "Maybe." She looked down the corridor toward the trauma bays, toward the board with its patient names and room assignments, and the whole complex machinery of a functioning emergency department. "Maybe not the same thing. There are other versions of it." "Like this?" "Something like this." He was quiet for a moment. "You're good at it," he said. "At both things, probably. But at this?" He gestured at the floor, at the department, at the context they were standing in. "You're really good at this." She didn't answer, but she didn't deflect, which for her was the closest thing to agreement. The night moved into its deepest hours. Delilah returned to the floor at 2 a.m. with a lawyer she'd reached by phone. A woman in a gray coat who arrived looking like someone who handled exactly this category of situation and had done so before. They went into a closed-room meeting with Reyes and one of the OIG team members, and the meeting ran for an hour and 40 minutes. And when it concluded, Delilah came back out and went to the charge desk and stood there for a moment looking at the board. The assignments, the patient names, the grid of a department she had run for 8 years, with an expression that was not readable from a distance. Then she picked up the charge phone and called the night supervisor. She was asking to be relieved from the rest of her shift. Marcus heard this from the nursing station. He looked at Nora, who was standing near the supply corridor entrance, and had also heard it. The night supervisor arrived 20 minutes later and took the desk. Delilah gathered her things from the charge office, a jacket, a thermos, a framed photograph that had sat on the corner of the desk. For so long Marcus had stopped seeing it, and she walked toward the main exit without making eye contact with anyone. She passed Nora in the corridor. She stopped. The two of them stood facing each other for a moment. The charge nurse, who had spent 11 months systematically erasing the professional existence of the nurse in front of her, and the nurse who had spent 11 months absorbing it without complaint and without explanation. There was nothing equal about what had passed between them. There was nothing that a hallway moment could balance. Delilah opened her mouth, closed it. The things she might have said, the defenses, the justifications, the years of professional certainty that she had been right about the people she dismissed, had no language anymore. The night had used up the language they would have required. She walked out. Nora watched her go. She did not feel she found the clean satisfaction that she might have expected from that moment. What she felt was more complicated. Not pity, not quite, but the specific flatness of someone who had been waiting for an accounting that had finally arrived and found that the arrival felt smaller than the waiting. Justice had a shape. It was not always the shape you'd built in your mind while you were still on the other side of it. She went back to the monitor display. Fielding, Pruitt, the boy Jamie, all stable, all holding. She stood at the display and looked at these numbers for a long moment, and then Hartwell appeared at the corridor entrance, and she turned to face him because she could tell from his posture that what he was about to say was the thing the evening had been building toward. Not the institutional accounting, not the OIG inquiry, but the personal one. The conversation she'd known was coming since she'd heard the rotors in the parking lot and understood what they meant. "Walk with me," he said. They walked to the end of the corridor away from the floor noise, to a window that looked out onto the parking lot where the aircraft were still sitting in the north section, blades folded now, the crew somewhere inside or in vehicles. The SUV was still there. The police unit had left an hour ago. Hartwell stood at the window. He looked out for a moment before he turned to her, and in the dark glass she could see both their reflections, his, solid and slightly forward-leaning even when he was standing still, and hers, her hair still pulled back tight, scrubs that had been through a mass casualty and showed it. "The placement is over," he said. "That was always going to be the outcome of this call, regardless of how tonight went." "I know. You've had 14 months since the incident. The physical recovery is documented. The clinical function is—" He stopped, looked at her. "Well, it's documented differently now than it was this morning." She said nothing. "There's going to be a formal review," he said, "of the placement program, of the oversight structure, of what should have been caught and flagged earlier, the harassment specifically. That's going to take time. Okay? And there are going to be decisions to make about what comes next for you." He said it carefully, the way he said everything carefully. "There are options. Some of them look like what you were doing before the incident. Some of them look different. You don't have to decide anything tonight." She looked at her reflection in the glass, at the scrubs, the posture, the hands that had done 43 field procedures, and tonight had done 2 more, at the face that had been navigating the small daily weight of being dismissed for 11 months, which was its own kind of test, not the same as the test she'd trained for, but not nothing. "The unit," she said, "my unit, from the last deployment." She said it to the glass, to the reflection. "Has anything—" "We lost 2 more, Hartwell said. Not gently. He didn't have that register, but not without care either. Vega and Kowalski. 6 months ago, unrelated. She absorbed that. It landed the way these things always landed, with the specific weight of names, not numbers, the way every person you'd served with had a particular material presence that their absence made permanent. The others?" she asked. "Most of them are through, a few still in program. Reyes was in your unit, you know that. He requested this assignment." She looked at Reyes, visible through the conference room glass, still running documentation. She hadn't known he'd requested it. She looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the parking lot. "I need time," she said, "to figure out what I want the next thing to look like. You have it." Hartwell turned away from the window. "You have as much of it as you need, within reason." "Within reason," she repeated. A dry edge in it. The closest thing to a smile she'd seen on his face crossed it briefly. "Within reason," he confirmed. He started to walk back toward the conference room. Stopped. "The hospital's CMO called in from off-site. He'll be here by 6. He's been briefed." He looked at her over his shoulder. "He wants to speak with you before we leave." "About what?" "About the fact that 3 critically injured patients are alive tonight because of decisions you made in this building. He wants to say something about that." Hartwell's voice was even. "I told him you'd probably accept a brief conversation." She hadn't agreed to that. He walked away as if she had. She stood at the window for a moment longer, looking at the parking lot, at the aircraft, at the dark edge of Decker's Bluff visible past the parking lot lights, the mountains behind it, the early October cold that had not relented. Somewhere to the east on Route 9, the cleanup at the bridge collapse was still ongoing, recovery teams working in the dark and the water, the particular slow and difficult work that came after the acute phase of disaster. She had not been part of that work tonight. She had been here, doing this, which was the work that had been in front of her. She turned from the window, started back toward the floor. Her phone buzzed. She stopped, pulled it out. The number was the same OIG number that had called before, but the message was text, not a call. And when she read it, her hand went still. 3 sentences. Preliminary review of Marsh records complete. Financial irregularities in procurement exceed initial estimate. We've also identified a third party, outside the hospital, connected to the supply ordering anomalies. She read it twice. Then a fourth sentence appeared, a follow-on text, arriving a beat after the first three, as if the sender had hesitated before sending it. The third party has an existing relationship with someone in your chain of command. She looked at the message, at those 2 lines. She thought about Hartwell, who had arrived in 3 hours, faster than a monitoring situation warranted, faster than a recovery placement termination warranted. She thought about the SUV in the parking lot that had been there before she made the call. She thought about Reyes, who had requested the assignment, which meant he'd known he was coming here before tonight. She thought about the shape of things that arranged themselves to look like one thing when they were actually another. Her hand tightened around the phone. She looked up. Through the glass of the conference room, Hartwell was speaking with Reyes. The conversation had the quality she'd seen in it all night. Professional, coordinated, 2 people who worked together regularly. She had assumed she knew the nature of that working relationship. She typed back to the OIG number, identify the third party. 3 seconds. Working on it. Don't discuss with anyone at the facility until we've confirmed, including federal personnel on site. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked through the conference room glass at Hartwell. He looked up at that exact moment and saw her looking. He nodded. The same professional nod he'd given her all evening, the nod of a commander to someone in his operational purview. She nodded back. And in the 3 seconds between the nod and looking away, she understood something that she should have asked about earlier and hadn't, because she'd been so focused on the immediate situation that she hadn't looked at the frame around it. Why had the OIG called her directly? Not Hartwell. Not the administrator. Her. Investigators running an inquiry contacted institutional actors through official channels. They didn't call the subject of a placement program 4 minutes before a briefing to give her advance information. That was not procedure. That was not how any of this worked. Unless the call wasn't from OIG, or unless it was from OIG, and the message it was carrying was specifically not intended for the people in that room. She stood in the corridor and felt the floor of the situation shift under her, in the particular way it shifted when you realized the structure you were standing in had more layers than the one you'd been navigating, and the layer below it had a different architecture entirely. The conference room door opened. Hartwell stepped into the corridor. CMO just arrived, he said. Conference room in 5 minutes. She looked at him, at the face she'd known for 3 years, the face of a man she had trusted in places where trust was a survival calculation. I'll be there, she said. He went back in. She stood in the corridor for 10 more seconds, alone. And in those 10 seconds, she did the math on everything she knew and everything she didn't know, and what the intersection of those 2 things meant for the next 5 minutes, and what it might mean for considerably longer. Then she reached into her pocket and held her phone and did not make a call. Not yet. She walked into the conference room at exactly 5 minutes. The CMO had arrived in the way CMOs arrived after being called in during a crisis. Slightly disheveled, coat over his arm, the particular alertness of someone who had been asleep 3 hours ago and was now running on the adrenaline of a situation that had escalated past the version described in the first phone call. His name was Dr. Gerald Mast, 61, silver-haired, the kind of institutional figure who had been in medicine long enough that his face had the settled quality of someone who had seen most categories of difficult and had stopped being surprised by them. He had not seen this category before. That was visible. He stood at the head of the table and he looked at Nora when she came in, and then he looked at Hartwell, and then he looked at the file folder that was still sitting open on the table with the field photograph on top, and he did the work of assembling what he was looking at with the focused efficiency of a physician accustomed to rapid assessment. "Sit down, everyone," he said. They sat. Nora took the same chair she'd had before. Hartwell sat across from her. Reyes stayed near the door. Mast remained standing. He had his reading glasses in one hand, not on his face, just held, the way people held objects when they needed something to do with their hands while they were thinking. "I've been briefed by Commander Hartwell and by the OIG representative," he said, "and I've reviewed the clinical notes from tonight's mass casualty response, including the informal nursing documentation from the wall pocket records in bays 3, 4, and 6. He paused. "I've also reviewed the incident report Dr. Holt filed at 5:12 this evening, and the suspension authorization that went through administrative processing, which I want to be clear should not have been finalized without CMO review on a complaint of this nature. That is a process failure on our end, and I own it. He said it the way Hartwell said difficult things, without softening, without the administrative instinct to distribute blame across a system so that no specific person had to carry it. It landed differently than most institutional apologies landed. The suspension is withdrawn, he said, effective immediately. All documentation associated with it will be expunged from the personnel record. That is not a negotiation. He looked at his glasses. What I want to say to you directly, Chief Petty Officer Voss, is that this hospital failed in its basic obligation tonight, not just in the administrative response to events, but in the 11 months preceding tonight. What was allowed to occur in this department, the assignment manipulation, the systematic isolation, the hostile conditions, that happened on our watch. It happened because the structures that should have caught it were compromised, and because the people who saw it didn't have adequate mechanism to escalate it, and because the person experiencing it had operational reasons for not surfacing it herself. He put his glasses on, took them off again. None of that changes the fact that it happened. Nora sat across from him and let this arrive. Not the words. She had expected some version of the words, but the quality of them. The absence of qualification. It was the kind of apology that was actually an apology and not a legal instrument wearing the clothes of one, and it was rarer than it should have been. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Mass said. "There's still a great deal to be done. The OIG inquiry is going to be disruptive to this facility. The investigations into Marsh and Holt will take time, and the process will be difficult for the floor staff who have to keep working through it." He looked at her. "I'd like to ask you something, and you are not obligated to answer." She waited. "Would you be willing to provide a formal account of your 11 months here? The specific incidents, the assignment patterns, the documentation you observed being altered, for the OIG inquiry?" He said it carefully. "Not as a complainant, as a witness. The distinction matters legally and it matters practically. Your account, with the specificity you likely have, would significantly accelerate the timeline." Nora looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at Hartwell, who gave her nothing. His expression stayed neutral, which she understood to mean this was her call, and he wasn't going to wait it either direction. She thought about the text on her phone, the third party, the question of who had sent it and why and what it meant for the people in this room. She had not resolved that question. She had walked in here holding it, and she was still holding it, and she was going to continue holding it until she had more than a text from an unconfirmed number to work with. "Yes," she said to Mast, "I'll provide a formal account." He nodded. Something in his posture adjusted. Not relaxed exactly, but settled, the way a person settled when a piece of a difficult puzzle had moved into place. "Good. We'll coordinate the timing with Commander Hartwell's team." He looked around the room. "Are there other items for tonight?" Reyes said, "We'll need a few more hours to complete the documentation review. My team will be on the floor until approximately 6. We'll minimize disruption to patient care." "Understood." Mass put his glasses in his coat pocket. He looked at Nora one more time, and there was something in the look that wasn't entirely administrative. The look of a physician seeing another clinician clearly for the first time, which was also, she understood, the look of a man who was reckoning with what his institution had done with someone who should have been recognized immediately and had instead been buried under 11 months of deliberate diminishment. He left without saying anything more. Sometimes the right move was to stop adding words to something that had enough of them. The floor at 4 in the morning had the particular quality that floors had at 4 in the morning. Stripped down, functional, the social machinery of institutional life reduced to its essential components. 2 nurses running the night coverage. A resident available by pager. The monitors doing their patient work in the bays, the numbers ticking along in their various registers. Nora walked the floor once, not as an active staff member, just walking it. Looking at the bays. Looking at the patients she'd touched tonight, most of them asleep or sedated, the quiet work of healing running in the background of their unconsciousness. Robert Fielding's bay had the curtain half open. She stopped at the threshold. He was asleep, both legs in external fixation. The drainage system she'd set up earlier replaced now by a surgical drain from the OR. His wife was in the chair beside the bed, a woman in her 60s, coat still on, one hand resting on the rail of the bed close to but not touching his hand, the particular posture of someone who had been sitting in a hospital chair for hours and had organized themselves around the long wait. She looked up when she heard Nora at the threshold. "Are you the nurse?" she asked. Her voice was low, careful of the sleeping man beside her. "I was on the floor tonight," Nora said. The woman looked at her for a moment. "The doctor in the OR. She said someone helped him before he went up. Someone in the ER who found what was wrong." She paused. "Was that you?" "A few people were working on him." "The doctor said one person in particular." She kept looking at Nora with the steady gaze of someone who was going to hold the question until she got something real back from it. I wanted to say thank you. He's all I have, 37 years. She looked at the sleeping man. He's all I have, and he's still here. Nora looked at Robert Fielding, at the rise and fall of his chest, the completely ordinary miracle of continued breathing, at his wife's hand near the rail. "He did most of it," Nora said. "His body fought hard." The woman smiled slightly at that, a small, tired, genuine smile. "That's very like him." Nora stepped back from the threshold. She walked on. She found the text at 4:30 when she was back in the corridor near the supply bay, the place she'd spent a significant portion of the evening working from. Her phone had buzzed while she was with Fielding's wife, and she hadn't looked at it. The number again. The same one. Third party confirmed. Contracting firm. Meridian Supply Group. 7-month supply contract with Harlow General, arranged through Marsh. Billing irregularities total approximately $340,000 over 22 months. The firm's listed operations director is a former Navy logistics officer. Name: Warren Pruell. He separated from service 4 years ago following a conduct review that was resolved informally. She read this. Read it again. Pruell has an existing relationship with one active duty officer in your operational chain. We have the communications. We are not yet prepared to identify the officer in this message because the confirmation process requires 48 hours. What we can tell you is that the officer is not Hartwell. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Not Hartwell. She read the last line. If you're asked about tonight's events by anyone other than OIG in the next 48 hours, you are not obligated to provide information beyond what is required. Sit tight. We have what we need to proceed. She put the phone in her pocket. The corridor was empty in both directions. She stood in it for a moment and felt the weight of the evening settling around her. Not falling on her, not that, but settling the way weight settled when you'd been carrying it at a run and had finally been permitted to slow down. The acute crisis was over. The institutional crisis was in process. The other thing, the layer beneath, the question of Pruell and the unnamed officer and the shape of a corruption that had apparently extended well beyond Delilah Marsh's filing system, was in other hands now, the hands of people whose specific job it was to follow those threads. Her job tonight was done. She walked back to the break room. She made coffee, the real kind, not the automatic machine, the stovetop method she'd used on every deployment because the process of it was grounding in a way that the automatic machine was not. She stood at the counter and waited for it and listened to the floor moving around her, the sounds of the building doing what buildings did at 4 in the morning when most of their people were asleep. Marcus found her there 20 minutes later. He came in and looked at the coffee and looked at her and sat down without being invited, which was the right call. He had the end-of-shift quality of someone who had given everything a long shift asked for and was running on fumes and still had forms to complete. She poured him a cup, set it in front of him. He looked at it. "Thank you." "You've been on since what, 6 yesterday morning?" "Yeah." He drank the coffee. It was hot, and he drank it anyway, which was the move of someone past the point of caution. "What's going to happen? With Marsh? With Holt?" She sat down across from him. The same chairs, the same table, different hour, different weight in the room. "Marsh will face the OIG inquiry and the hospital's internal review simultaneously," she said. "The financial irregularities are documented and the metadata on the record alterations is apparently conclusive. She'll lose her license, probably face criminal charges for the procurement fraud, which is the more legally serious piece." "And Holt? The pattern complaint?" 3 suppression actions in 14 months, is going to an independent review board. His surgical outcomes in the 2 prior cases are going to be re-examined. He may not lose his license depending on what the clinical review finds, but he'll lose trauma leadership. The mandatory competency review that Hartwell mentioned isn't optional. She paused. He's a capable physician who developed a habit of protecting himself at other people's expense. That habit has a bill that comes due eventually. Marcus turned his cup in his hands. 11 months, he said. You watched her manipulate that floor for 11 months and you never said anything. I had operational reasons. I know. I'm not criticizing. I'm just thinking about the other people who weren't here for operational reasons. The nurses who transferred out. The one who took medical leave that everyone knew wasn't really medical leave. He looked at his cup. They didn't have a Hartwell to call. She sat with that. It was the true thing, the one that sat underneath the evening's particular accounting, that the resolution of this specific situation, with its specific intervention and its specific institutional mechanism, was not a general solution. The floor had been what it had been for longer than 11 months. The nurses who had left before Nora arrived had left into a system that had no mechanism for what happened to them. And the OIG inquiry would address the financial fraud and the record alterations, and the hospital would put new oversight structures in place, and some version of this would work better for the next person. But the previous people were still gone. No, she said. They didn't. He nodded, drank his coffee. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know it's okay if you tell me it's none of my business. Go ahead. The incident, the last deployment, the one Hartwell mentioned. He said it carefully. What happened? She looked at her cup. The coffee was good, better than the automatic machine, it always was. She'd made it the same way in a forward operating base in conditions that had very little in common with this break room, and it had tasted the same then, which was one of the small reliable things you held on to when the large reliable things were not available. We were extracting a civilian asset, she said. Medical extraction. The asset had injuries that required a medic on the ground. I was the medic. There were 7 of us, including the asset. She stopped. She was choosing the level of detail carefully, not because she didn't trust Marcus, but because the detail had a weight and she'd learned to carry it in specific doses. The extraction went wrong. Enemy engagement. We lost 4 operators. She paused. I got the asset out and 2 of my people. The other 4... She stopped again. I was the medic. In an extraction that goes wrong, the medic's job is to keep people alive long enough to get to the next position. I did that job for 2 of them. There weren't enough of me for all 4. The break room was quiet. That's not a failure, Marcus said. I know. Then why did you spend 14 months in a recovery program? She looked at him. Because I knew it wasn't a failure, and I couldn't make myself feel that it wasn't a failure. Those are 2 different things. She said it plainly. The brain that makes tactical decisions in a field environment is not the same brain that processes what happened after. You can be functionally correct and emotionally wrecked at the same time. The program was for the second one. He was quiet for a moment. And now? Better, she said. She said it without decoration because it was accurate and because she'd learned that the accurate word was almost always more useful than the complete word. He nodded, finished his coffee. He stood up, picked up both cups, washed them at the sink. She watched him do this, the small, considerate domestic act of a person who cleaned up after himself even at 4:30 in the morning at the end of a 16-hour shift. And she thought that this was the kind of detail that told you most of what you needed to know about a person. Not the big moments, the small ones. What a person did when nobody was requiring anything of them. He set the cups on the rack, turned around. For what it's worth, he said, the 4 you lost. They were lucky to have you there. Not because you saved 2, because you were trying for all 4. He paused. That counts, even when it doesn't feel like it counts. She looked at him for a moment. Go finish your charts, she said, and go home. He smiled, tired, real, the kind of smile that didn't have any performance in it. Yes, ma'am. He left. She sat at the table for another minute, and then she stood up and she went back to the floor. The CMO's formal statement to the hospital board went out at 9:17 in the morning, by which point the day shift had fully taken over and the night's events had circulated through the building in the particular rapid way that things circulated through hospitals, which was to say completely and with a level of detail that official communications never quite achieved. The statement confirmed the withdrawal of the suspension, the initiation of the internal review, and the extraordinary clinical contribution of nursing staff during the mass casualty response. It did not name Nora directly. That was a legal and operational decision coordinated with Hartwell's office. But it described the specific interventions in enough detail that everyone who had been on the floor the previous night understood exactly who it was referring to. The OIG issued a separate formal notice to the hospital's administrative leadership confirming the open inquiry and its scope. This document was internal and not circulated broadly, but it reached Holt through legal counsel by 10 in the morning, and it reached the hospital board by 11. And by noon, the conversations that had been happening in administrative offices in careful language began to happen in plainer language, which was the institutional sign that the situation had crossed from manageable to structural. Holt was placed on administrative leave pending the independent clinical review. The notification came through the CMO's office, formal and complete, and it specified that his trauma leadership designation was suspended immediately and his privileges were under review. He was in the physician's lounge when he received it, sitting at the same table, the same two hands flat on the surface. And the staff who passed the lounge window that morning reported that he sat there for a long time after, not moving, not on his phone, just sitting with the weight of a decision that had been made above him and delivered cleanly without room for negotiation. He had spent years being the person who made the decisions. He was now the subject of one. The two experiences were very different. Delilah did not return to the hospital that morning. Her lawyer communicated on her behalf with the OIG team, and the conversation that followed was the kind that began formal proceedings rather than resolving them. The start of a long process that would move through documentation and hearings and eventual outcomes that were still months away. But the shape of it was clear. The metadata on the record alterations was what Reyes had said it was, conclusive. The procurement fraud had a paper trail that Meridian Supply Group's involvement only deepened. She had been the operational center of both. She had been very careful. She had not been careful enough. The Nursing License Review Board was notified by OIG that morning as a courtesy, which was the process that began the parallel track of professional consequences running alongside the criminal one. That track moved slower than the others, but it moved, and when it completed, in 7 months, as it turned out, after a review that went into more detail about the record alterations than anyone on the floor had known to look for, it moved to the only conclusion the evidence supported. The board revoked her license. 22 years of emergency nursing, the credential that had been the core of her professional identity, the thing she had organized the authority structure of an entire department around. Gone. Not suspended. Revoked. The distinction mattered, and the board made it clearly, and the language of the revocation document described the specific nature of the record alterations and their clinical impact in terms that left no ambiguity about what the board understood she had done and why. Nora was not present for any of this. She didn't need to be. She spent the morning in a series of meetings she had not chosen, but that the situation had generated around her the way situations generated their own gravity. First, a formal debrief with Hartwell and 2 members of his team, running through the 11 months in the sequential order that formal debriefs required, the specific incidents documented with dates and descriptions and clinical details where relevant. She gave it the same way she gave everything, accurately, completely, without embellishment, and without minimization. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. At the end of it, one of the team members, a woman named Gallagher, who had been taking notes throughout with the focused speed of someone who wrote everything, looked up from her notes and said, "You documented this yourself while it was happening." "Not officially," Nora said. "Where?" "A personal record. Dates, incidents, clinical context." She paused. "I wasn't sure I'd ever use it, but I kept it current." Gallagher looked at Hartwell. He had the expression of someone who had just received information that confirmed something he'd suspected. "Can we have a copy?" Gallagher asked. "Yes," Nora said. Second meeting, the OIG representative, a trim woman of about 50 named Dorset, who wore a jacket that fit precisely and asked questions with the minimal word efficiency of someone who had learned that additional language created additional ambiguity. She was interested specifically in what Nora had observed about the record alterations, the effects of them, the pattern, what she'd noticed, and when. Nora told her. Dorset listened and took notes and then said, "The individual I'm looking at for the Meridian Supply Group connection. You've never encountered the name Warren Pruill?" "Not directly," Nora said. "I know the name now." "But not from your 11 months here." "No." Dorset looked at her notes. "The officer in your operational chain with the Pruill connection. I want to be clear that our confirmation is complete as of this morning. The officer is not in this building and is not known to you personally." She looked up. "I'm telling you this because I want you to know the scope of what you walked into was larger than the building you were placed in, and it is being addressed at a level above this facility." Nora looked at her. "Who is the officer?" "That I can't tell you. What I can tell you is that they will no longer be in their current position by end of week." It wasn't everything, but it was enough to close the loop she'd been holding open since the text arrived, and she let it close. Third meeting. Dr. Mast again, brief, in his office rather than the conference room, which was a smaller and more direct setting. He asked whether she would be willing to speak with the board's quality committee about the structural changes that would be implemented in the ER department going forward. Not about the incidents specifically, those were documented, but about the design of the oversight system, the gaps she'd observed, what a better structure would need to include. She said yes. He looked at her over his desk, this man who ran a hospital and had spent the previous night discovering what his hospital had been doing in one of its departments. And he said, "I want to ask you something that is not within my official purview as CMO." She waited. "What would you want? From us? From this institution? If we could offer anything." He said it carefully. "I'm not in a position to repair 11 months. Nobody is. But I'm asking because I think the question deserves to be asked." She thought about it honestly, which meant she sat with it for a moment instead of producing the first available answer. "I want the next person," she said. He waited. "The next person who comes through your ER, who isn't what they appear, who's been through something, who's carrying something, who's quiet in a way that reads as incompetent to people who measure competence by volume." She said it plainly. "I want someone to notice them before it takes a year and a mass casualty and a federal intervention. I want the structure to be designed so that a Delilah Marsh can't build a comfortable 11 months of erasure around a person and have nobody ask a question." Mass looked at her. He wrote something on the notepad in front of him. "I'll put that to the committee directly." She stood. He stood. "For what it's worth," he said, and then stopped himself. Started again. "What you did last night, for this hospital, for those patients, will not be forgotten. I'll make sure of it." He paused. "The board has voted, as of this morning, to formally commend the nursing staff response during the mass casualty event. Your name will be in that commendation, in full. Your service will be in it." She nodded once. "Thank you, Dr. Mast." She walked out. Marcus was gone by the time she came back to the floor. He'd left at 9, the end of his shift, and she hoped he'd slept in his car in the parking lot the way she knew he sometimes did after long nights rather than making the 40-minute drive home on fumes. Dr. Adair was still there because residents didn't get the luxury of clean shift endings. And she was at the nursing station writing notes with the focused efficiency of someone running on borrowed time, but unwilling to let the standard slip. She looked up when Nora passed. "Fielding's transferring to a step-down unit," she said. "Pressure's been stable all morning. The ortho team has a plan for the legs." "Good. Sandra Pruitt's breathing on her own. They're going to try extubation this afternoon." Adair looked at her notes. "And Jamie, the boy from the bridge, his mother came in. They were in the room together for about an hour." She looked up. He was calm, really calm. The nurses on the day shift said he'd been anxious all night, but when she got there, he just settled. Nora thought about the boy in the bay, the way she'd talked him down, the simple instruction to breathe and keep his eyes on her and say something if it got worse. She thought about his mother's name, Patricia. He'd given it to her in the middle of a panic, one anchoring word. "That's good," she said. Adair put her pen down. "Are you? What happens now? For you?" "I don't know exactly." "Are you staying here?" Nora looked at the floor, the bays, the board, the nursing station with its controlled chaos of charts and calls, and the continuous demands of a department that never fully stopped. She'd spent 11 months in this specific building being systematically made to feel like she didn't belong in it, and what she felt looking at it now was not affection, exactly. The building didn't deserve affection. It was concrete and fluorescent light, and the accumulated institutional memory of decisions made and not made. But the work that happened inside it. For now, she said. Yes. Adair nodded. She picked up her pen. She went back to her notes. Hartwell found her at noon. She was in the ambulance bay, outside, in the thin October sunlight that had finally burned through the cloud cover. The helicopters were gone. They'd left at 7. Once the documentation was complete and the immediate situation was contained, the parking lot looked like a parking lot again. The black SUV was gone. The police unit was gone. The particular organized presence that had descended on Harlow General the night before had dissolved back into the ordinary world, leaving only the institutional aftermath and the patients in the bays and the memory of what had happened. He came out through the ambulance bay doors and stood beside her in the sunlight. He didn't say anything immediately. She didn't either. I've had calls from 3 people this morning about you, he said eventually, about my placement status. Yes, and about what happened last night. He looked at the parking lot. There are people who want you back in operational capacity. Full rotation, different assignment, the skill set deployed the way it was designed to be deployed. I know. And there are people who think the program should be re-examined, the placement model, the oversight, the conditions that allowed what happened here to run for 11 months without a flag. He paused. I'm one of them. She looked at him. I approved your placement, he said. I reviewed the site, the facility, the staffing environment. I did not adequately account for what a compromised charge nurse could do to a placement over time. He said it with the flat accountability she'd come to expect from him. I should have. The program failed you, and I am the program. You also got here in 3 hours, she said. I got here in 3 hours because the system worked the way it was supposed to work when you made the call. It should have been working every day for 11 months. He looked at her. Those are not the same thing. She accepted that. What do you want? He asked. The same question Mast had asked, but from a different angle. Not institutional obligation, operational reality. Full disclosure. I have a request from a medical training program that would use your specific skill set to develop curriculum for combat casualty care translated to civilian emergency settings. It's not deployment. It's not clinical placement. It's teaching, she said. Yes. She thought about Dr. Adair writing notes at the nursing station, about the resident named Flores who had paused 1 beat too long over a critical patient and then had corrected course when someone directed him clearly, about every young clinician on that floor who had been trained in the theory of emergency medicine and would spend their career discovering that theory and practice were related but not identical. She thought about the things she knew, the 43 field procedures, the tactical medical protocols, the specific embodied knowledge of how the human body behaved under catastrophic stress, and how to respond to that behavior with speed and accuracy and the particular kind of calm that was not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. She thought about what it would mean to transfer that knowledge deliberately, structurally, into the hands of people who would use it in rooms like the one she'd spent last night in. Tell me more about the program, she said. He told her. It took 15 minutes. She listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, tracking the details and the implications simultaneously. When he finished, she looked at the parking lot for a moment, at the mountains behind Decker's Bluff, the high, sharp ridgeline of the Rockies in October, the kind of landscape that put human scale in perspective without being cruel about it. I'll consider it, she said. That's all I'm asking. He went back inside. She stayed in the sunlight for a few more minutes, because the sunlight was thin and cold and real, and she had been inside for most of the past 24 hours. She left the hospital at 2 in the afternoon, not dramatically, not with an escort or a ceremony or any of the formal apparatus of a departure. She picked up her bag from the locker room. She changed out of her scrubs into the clothes she'd worn in the night before, jeans, a dark jacket, boots, and she walked through the main corridor toward the exit. The floor was on day shift rhythm. She passed the trauma bays without going in. She passed the nursing station where 2 day nurses she barely knew were running the afternoon management. and they looked up at her, and one of them, a woman named Torres, who'd been on the floor the night before and had come back for the day shift out of the particular professional commitment of someone who didn't leave during an incomplete situation, gave her a nod. Not warm, not cold. Collegial. The nod between people who had been in a difficult place together. She nodded back. She passed the supply corridor where she had spent a significant portion of the previous night working from the margins. She passed the break room. She passed the hallway that led to the conference room where, 14 hours ago, a file folder had been opened on a table and the picture it made had changed the architecture of the evening completely. She pushed through the main entrance doors. The cold hit her and she stopped for a moment on the sidewalk. The parking lot was ordinary in the afternoon light. Cars, a few ambulances at the bay, the routine of a functioning hospital. No helicopters, no black SUVs, no officers with detainment paperwork, just the ordinary world doing its ordinary work. She had a car in the lot, a 10-year-old truck she'd bought 2 months into the placement because Montana required a vehicle and she hadn't wanted anything that required too much attention. She walked to it. She got in. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel before starting it. She thought about a specific moment from the night before. Not the chest tube, not the needle decompression, not the moment Hartwell had opened the file folder. She thought about Robert Fielding's wife in the chair beside the bed, one hand near the rail, 37 years in her posture. He's all I have, and he's still here. She had not been someone's everything for a long time. She had not been anyone's anything in the particular sustained way that that woman meant it. The work she did, the nature of it, the conditions of it, the way it required her to be available and present and unattached in a specific operational sense, had not been compatible with that kind of continuity. She didn't know if that would change. She didn't know what the teaching program would lead to, or whether the OIG's investigation would surface more of the corruption beneath the surface of what had happened here, or what the officer in her chain with the Pruell connection would cost the people around him when the full scope of it came clear. She didn't know what healing felt like when it was complete rather than ongoing, because she had not been there yet. What she knew was this. Last night, on a floor where she had been categorized as expendable, she had done what she'd been built and trained and broken and rebuilt to do. She had done it in the margins, with nothing granted to her, against active opposition, in a building that had spent 11 months trying to make her invisible. And the patients who had needed her had lived. That was not nothing. That was in fact the precise opposite of nothing. She started the truck. She pulled out of the parking lot onto the main road, and Harlow General Medical Center disappeared in the rearview mirror, and she drove north toward the mountains in the thin October sunlight. There is something that institutions never want to admit, which is that the people they underestimate are often the ones doing the most essential work. Not because suffering creates competence, it doesn't, that's a story people tell to make injustice feel meaningful, but because the people who get dismissed early learn to build their capability on something more durable than recognition. They learn to work without applause. They learn to make the decision the situation requires, not the decision that will be noticed. They learn that the room doesn't have to be watching for the thing to matter. Nora Voss had not been broken by what they tried to do to her. She had also not been unaffected by it. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and both of them mattered. The damage was real. The person doing the damage had always been looking at someone she fundamentally misread, and the misreading cost her everything eventually. But the damage was real. The reason this story ends the way it does is not that justice always arrives on helicopters in the nick of time. Usually doesn't. What arrived last night in that parking lot was a specific mechanism, a specific set of circumstances, a classified program, and a federal inquiry, and a commander who drove 3 hours because a call came through. Most people do not have that call to make. What they have is what Nora had before the call. The willingness to walk back through the side door when the alert sounded, knowing it would make everything worse for herself because the math of the patient's need was larger than the math of her own protection. That decision was made before any helicopter arrived. It was made in a side doorway at 6 in the evening in the cold by a woman who had been told for 11 months that she was nobody and who picked up her bag and went back in anyway. That is the thing that cannot be trained out of a person, not by a Delilah Marsh, not by a Roman Holt, not by 11 months of being assigned to the worst shifts and denied the basic professional respect that every person on that floor had earned and only some of them received. The quiet ones are watching. They are learning the room. They are cataloging every detail and running the math and waiting for the moment when the situation requires everything they have. And when that moment comes, they will not ask anyone's permission. They will simply move.